Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet, shadowy, and deeply human world of medieval Europe. The forgotten intimacy of flickering candles and creaking beds, a hidden side of history where lords, peasants, and monks all explored longing, shame, and secrecy beneath cold stone ceilings. It wasn't just a time of wars and kings. It was where desire, silence, beauty, and discomfort lived side by side under the weight of religion and superstition. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with one strange but revealing truth. Most medieval people didn't sleep alone, even if they wanted to. In our modern world, the act of going to bed is wrapped in layers of ritual and privacy. We dim the lights, shut the door, wrap ourselves in blankets, and retreat from the world. But in the medieval period, sleep was not an individual act. It was communal, exposed, and practical. The idea of a private bedroom, a room meant for just one person or even one couple, was unheard of outside the highest ranks of nobility. And even there, solitude was often more symbolic than real. Most people, rich or poor, slept in the presence of others, not always out of intimacy, but out of survival. In the small timber-framed cottages of peasants and farmers, entire families would sleep in one room, often with the animals as well. Livestock, like goats, chickens, and pigs, weren't just for food. They were sources of warmth. Children slept next to parents, elders beside infants. Everyone huddled close together on makeshift bedding. Straw, hay, old sacks, sometimes a shared cloth or fur pelt. No pillows, no mattresses, no bed sheets in the way we imagine them. Just the smell of soil, sweat, smoke, and closeness. It was a nightly ritual of necessity, not comfort. In winter months especially, sleeping together, quite literally, meant surviving the night. And in towns or cities, it wasn't much different. Apprentices in merchant homes would sleep under tables or in storage areas near the goods they were meant to protect. Travelers at roadside inns or taverns didn't rent rooms. They rented space. Often, that meant climbing into a bed already occupied by one or more strangers. Hot bedding, it was sometimes called, where one person's body heat still lingered in the mattress as the next one slipped in. People slept back to back, head to toe, and side by side with complete strangers. It may sound uncomfortable, even unthinkable, to us, but to them, it was ordinary. Survival stripped away embarrassment. Even the noble and elite did not always sleep alone. Lords and ladies had chambers, yes, but rarely were they truly private. Servants, guards, handmaids, and messengers came and went. Some slept at the foot of their masters' beds, ready to be summoned with a whisper. A noblewoman might share her chamber with several ladies in waiting, not for friendship, but for security and control. And within marriage, sleeping had layers of purpose, political consummation, religious duty, even ceremonial demonstration. The wedding night itself, in many regions, was not a private affair. Witnesses, yes, actual people, might wait just outside the room, or even remain inside to verify that the marriage was truly sealed. A stained bedsheet displayed the next morning was often the only proof a family had that honor and legitimacy had been maintained. In monasteries and convents, where silence and discipline were the pillars of life, even the sleep schedule was controlled. Monks slept in long stone halls called dormitories, in rows of wooden pallets or straw mats. Nuns, too, shared space, often waking together for night prayers, with little to no personal space in between. Beds were narrow, often more than rough platforms. The air was cold, the floors were harder, and the concept of bedtime was governed by bells and candles, not comfort or preference. Curtains, if they existed, were thin and symbolic, more a nod to modesty than an actual barrier. This lack of privacy shaped not only their experience of rest, but their understanding of the body, of intimacy, and of personal boundaries. Nudity wasn't inherently S3Xualized. It was often practical. Changing clothes or breastfeeding in front of others wasn't scandalous. It was simply life. But paradoxically, this constant exposure made private desire even more secret. The line between what was physical and what was emotional became blurry, and people developed subtle ways to express affection or longing. A look, a hidden letter, a touch beneath a blanket when no one was watching. For medieval people, sleep wasn't just a time to rest. It was a continuation of life's negotiations. Who you shared your sleeping space with could reflect your class, your work, your gender, your trust, or your power. And while the modern world allows us the luxury of drawing curtains and shutting doors, the medieval night was filled with breath and bodies, soft whispers and restless turning, prayers muttered half asleep, the crackle of dying embers, the cold, creeping in through thatched roofs, and the deep, vulnerable silence of people who had no choice but to sleep side by side, hoping to wake again in the morning. Bedrooms in the medieval world weren't private. In fact, the very notion of a private personal sleeping space is a modern invention, one most medieval people would have found completely foreign. If you lived in Europe between the 5th and 15th centuries, chances are you had no room of your own, no bed to yourself, and no expectation of sleeping alone. The medieval home was a place of survival, not comfort. Most peasants lived in single-room cottages, constructed of timber, earth, and straw. These rooms functioned as kitchens, workspaces, gathering areas, birthing zones, and finally, sleeping quarters, when the day's chores were done, when the animals were quiet and the sun had long since set. The entire family would prepare for bed in that same single room. But preparing was a loose term. There was no bedtime routine, no brushing teeth by the mirror or reading under a soft lamp. Instead, it meant laying out bundles of hay, wool blankets, or cloth sacks, if you were lucky, and lying down shoulder to shoulder, generation to generation. 5, 6, sometimes even 10 people might share that small space. Parents, infants, toddlers, teenagers, grandparents, all arranged in a huddle, bound together by the need for warmth. There were no partitions, no screens, no closed doors. Privacy was neither expected nor possible. At most, a curtain might hang around a married couple's corner of the bed, but even that was more symbolic than effective. In some households, the family pig slept near the hearth, chickens roosted overhead, and dogs curled beside human feet. The body heat of animals wasn't considered unsanitary. It was protection from the cold. In the dead of winter, with freezing winds seeping through cracked wooden walls and thatched roofs, having more bodies in the room meant a better chance of surviving the night. In middle-class homes and city dwellings, the sleeping arrangements weren't much more refined. Artisans, merchants, and craftsmen often lived above or behind their shops, where one room served multiple purposes. Apprentices slept on benches, under tables, or on thin mats beside the embers of the cooking fire. Children curled beside their mothers. Workers fell asleep in their dusty clothes. Beds were scarce, and when present, they were shared, often by more than just family. In guest homes and inns, travelers who had never met before were expected to share the same mattress, sometimes lying head to foot to preserve space. There were no hotel keys, no private bookings, no twin beds. You simply paid for a spot and hoped your bedmate didn't snore, or worse. Even among the wealthy, solitude was not a guarantee. Lords and ladies might sleep in more elaborate surroundings, with high wooden bed frames, feather-stuffed mattresses, and heavy drapes. But they too were rarely alone. Servants, chambermaids, and attendants were a constant presence. A noblewoman might have 2 or 3 ladies in waiting sharing her chamber. A king might have guards sleeping just beyond his bed for protection. In royal courts, where status and hierarchy mattered above all, who slept where and beside whom was a delicate political matter. Bedchambers were symbols of power, not retreats of peace. Marriages were often consummated with witnesses nearby. Privacy, in the modern sense, simply didn't exist. In monasteries and convents, where silence and discipline were the core of life, the same communal model persisted. Monks and nuns slept in long, narrow dormitories lined with wooden pallets. Some slept in their robes, rising multiple times each night for prayer. Their sleep was short, rigid, and shared. More spiritual duty than rest. The idea was not to indulge the body, but to train it toward endurance and humility. In this, sleep became another form of devotion, stripped of comfort and indulgence. All of this reveals something important about the medieval world. Physical closeness was not a luxury. It was a necessity. And while that closeness could be comforting, it could also be stifling. There was no space for secrets, no room to cry in solitude, no quiet corner to reflect alone. Every emotion, every dream, every restless shift in the night was felt by someone else nearby. In this environment, people developed a different relationship with the body. Modesty meant behavior, not space. The line between public and private was blurred. People dressed and undressed in front of each other. Sickness, childbirth, aging, even death. These weren't isolated events. They happened in the same room where bread was baked, and children were rocked to sleep. So when we imagine the medieval night, we must forget the picture of a solitary figure beneath a quilted blanket in a quiet, candle-lit room. Instead, imagine the flickering firelight casting shadows on stone or plaster walls, the heavy breathing of multiple sleepers, the snort of a pig in the corner, the creak of wood under shifting weight, a mother reaching over a child, a father whispering a final prayer, a stranger coughing in his sleep just a few feet away. This was the medieval bedroom, crowded, warm, noisy, and profoundly human. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely a personal journey of love. It was a public transaction, a carefully calculated agreement between families, not individuals. While today, we think of marriage as the union of two hearts, two souls. Choosing to walk through life side by side, the medieval mind saw it as something entirely different. It was less about love and more about lineage, less about feelings and more about function. A marriage was a tool, a way to transfer property, preserve honor, secure peace, multiply labor, or even end feuds. It was a bond made not from the heart, but from necessity, politics, and survival. Among the nobility, this reality was especially sharp. Kings and lords didn't marry for affection. They married to expand their borders. A young noblewoman, barely into her teens, might find herself betrothed to a man decades older, a duke, an earl, a foreign prince, all for the sake of alliance. Her hand might be offered to a rival kingdom to avoid war. Her body would carry the hope of peace between two houses. Her name would vanish into his lineage, and her future would no longer be hers. In some cases, these marriages were arranged before the bride had even been born. The contract drawn up between fathers, sealed with wax, and honored regardless of the girl's opinion when the time came. She could cry, she could pray, she could beg, but her fate would already be decided. The dowry was the center of these negotiations. It might include money, livestock, land, textiles, jewels, anything the bride's family could offer to sweeten the deal. A large dowry might secure a higher status husband. A small one might condemn a girl to a lesser match. In return, the groom's family was expected to provide for the bride, a home, protection, and sometimes what was called a mourning gift, a token given after the wedding night to affirm the union. These exchanges were more than traditions. They were legal commitments. If a dowry wasn't delivered, or if a promise was broken, families could go to court, sometimes fighting for years over what was owed. But this practice was not limited to royalty. Even in villages, in cottages surrounded by fields and forests, marriages were arranged with practical eyes. A farmer might seek out a daughter from a blacksmith's family, not because he loved her, but because he needed tools repaired. A weaver's son might marry a girl from a brewer's household, ensuring both families had access to warm cloth and good ale. Love was a luxury. Survival was the goal. Parents didn't ask their children if they felt butterflies. They asked how many acres the groom owned, how many hens the bride could manage, how strong her back was, how honest his reputation seemed. And once the decision was made, it was final. Girls in particular had little say. A daughter was raised, not just as a child, but as an investment. Her behavior reflected on the entire household. If she was obedient, modest, and hardworking, she would make a good wife. If she was seen laughing too much, or wandering alone, or speaking too freely, she could bring shame. Some fathers married off daughters young, as early as 12, simply to be rid of the financial burden. Others traded them to erase debts, and when the wedding day came, the girl might stand beside a stranger, repeat vows she barely understood, and step into a life she had no power to shape. And yet the ceremony itself could be grand or humble. In royal courts, weddings were spectacles, attended by hundreds, with days of feasting and jousting. In the countryside, a wedding might be held at the church door with a loaf of bread, a jug of ale, and a handful of neighbours. Regardless of scale, the symbolism was the same, the passing of a woman from the care of her father to the authority of her husband. It was not a joining of equals, it was a transfer of ownership. Inside the marriage, power imbalances were stark. The husband held legal and social control. He decided where they lived, what the wife could do, whether she could inherit, and in many cases, whether she could leave. Women had few rights. Divorce was almost unheard of, except in cases of extreme abuse or impotence. And even then, only with church approval and often at great cost. A woman who fled her husband could be branded as a criminal. One who remained and suffered in silence was praised for her virtue. Still, not every medieval marriage was cold or cruel. Over time, some couples developed bonds, not fiery romances, but mutual respect, shared hardship, the raising of children, the burying of elders, the building of a home stone by stone. These experiences could create something tender, something real. There are letters from the period, written by husbands to wives, that reveal moments of deep affection. There are poems that suggest playful flirtation. But these moments were born within marriage, not the reason for it. Love, if it came at all, was a slow ember, not the spark that lit the match. And it is important to note, there were exceptions. In rare cases, especially among the merchant class in later centuries, personal preference began to matter more. In some towns, young people had more say in choosing their partner, especially if both families were of similar status. But even then, the final approval rested with the parents, and their considerations remained economic. The church played a complicated role in all this. It insisted that marriage was sacred, a bond made before God. But it also reinforced obedience, hierarchy, and the suppression of desire. A husband and wife were permitted intimacy, but only under strict conditions, and never for pleasure alone. The church warned against lust, even within wedlock. Too much passion could lead to sin. So, couples were told when they could sleep together, when they must abstain, and how often they should try to produce children. Even the bedroom was regulated by theology. So if you imagine a medieval marriage as two lovers riding off into the sunset, hand in hand, think again. Picture instead a father whispering a final instruction to his daughter as she is handed to, a man she barely knows. Picture a boy being told, "She's yours now. Treat her well or don't, but feed her." Picture contracts written in Latin, sealed with wax, and binding for life. Picture children watching their parents, not in love, but in duty, and learning to expect the same. This was marriage for most of the medieval world. A structure, a strategy, a social contract, and sometimes, through luck, patience, and grace, something like love would grow from the soil of expectation. But it was never guaranteed, it was never required, and for many, it was never even imagined. The first night of marriage, a moment we often picture today as filled with love, intimacy, and private celebration. In modern imaginations, it might involve candles flickering on a bedside table, soft whispers exchanged between newlyweds, or nervous laughter breaking the silence of a tender moment. But in the medieval world, that night, the night after, vows were spoken and hands were joined, was often something else entirely. Not private, not gentle, not romantic. Instead, it could be a night wrapped in ritual, burdened with legal consequences, religious expectations, and sometimes witnessed by others. Yes, witnessed. Because in many parts of medieval Europe, particularly among the upper classes, the consummation of marriage, the physical act of union, was not just a personal milestone, it was a legal requirement. The church and civil courts both agreed. A marriage wasn't truly valid until it had been consummated. That is, until the couple had proven their union through sex. Without that proof, a marriage could be declared void, erased, and with it, any transfer of land, title, or inheritance would also be undone. So this intimate act, which today we consider deeply personal, was instead treated like a public obligation, one that could be regulated, monitored, and even challenged in court. For noble families, this night might begin not with passion, but with ceremony. After the wedding feast, the couple would be escorted to their marital chamber. But they wouldn't walk there alone. A small parade of witnesses, family members, servants, sometimes even legal advisors or clergy, would accompany them. They might carry torches. They might sing songs or offer toasts. Some traditions even required the bride and groom to drink symbolic wine or eat specific foods to invoke fertility. Once inside the room, there might be a short religious ceremony. A priest could bless the bed itself, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers for a fruitful and pious union. He might ask God to protect the couple from sin, grant them healthy children, and strengthen their bond through chastity and virtue. A paradox, considering what was expected to happen next. In some cases, the bed itself would be specially prepared, clean linens, herbal bundles tied to the bedposts, religious icons placed nearby. All of it meant to sanctify what was, at its core, a deeply physical act. But the strangest detail for modern ears, the idea of witnesses staying behind. There are recorded customs, especially in royal and aristocratic circles, where trusted attendants remained in the room during the bedding ceremony. Some simply stood at the door, listening. Others sat, quietly in the corner, pretending not to watch. Their presence meant only to verify that the marriage had been properly begun. In some parts of France and England, it was tradition for female attendants to undress the bride, while male attendants undressed the groom. The couple would then be placed into bed, often side by side, under covers, while a prayer was spoken aloud. Only then would the room be cleared and the doors shut, but not always. In rare and uncomfortable cases, often when political alliances or major dowries were involved, the consummation itself might be partially witnessed. No, not fully watched, but monitored. Some reports suggest that attendants would check the sheets the next morning for signs of virginity, a small trace of blood, believed to confirm that the bride had been untouched before the marriage. Others might ask the groom to declare whether the act had taken place. And in even more extreme scenarios, if a union was contested, the couple might be asked to testify or even demonstrate their ability to perform before church officials or medical examiners. It sounds strange, even cruel. But in the medieval mindset, sex within marriage wasn't a private pleasure. It was a social duty. It was how property was passed, how heirs were created, how dynasties continued. For the church, it was allowed, but only within strict limits. Sex was to be used for procreation, not pleasure. Anything beyond missionary position was considered suspect. Certain days of the week, certain religious holidays, even phases of the moon were believed to be inappropriate for intercourse. A couple who defied these taboos risked spiritual consequences, disease, deformity in children, or even damnation. And so, even in their own bedroom, newlyweds were not free. Their desires were policed by both doctrine and superstition. And what about the people themselves, the bride and groom? Consider the young girl, perhaps 13 or 14, taken from her family home and given to a man twice her age. She may have met him once, maybe not at all. She's been dressed in elaborate clothing, paraded before nobles, and now stands at the edge of a bed she does not understand. Her mother may have whispered hints, but there was no education, no gentle preparation, just the weight of expectation. She's been told to be obedient, to be silent, to do what's required. Across from her, the groom may be little better prepared. Perhaps he is a warrior, raised to fight, not love. Or a scholarly man, awkward in the presence of women. Or maybe he is kind and wishes to be gentle, but is told by elders that now is not the time for gentleness. He must take his wife. He must prove his virility. For him, this act is not about bonding, it's about honor. The emotional cost? Deep. Some couples grew into affection later, through years of shared hardship. But others never found love. The marriage bed became a place of duty, of silence, of cold repetition. In some cases, a place of fear. And yet, society celebrated it. Poets wrote verses about the joy of the first night. Paintings, often symbolic, depicted the joining of flesh and name. Ballads were sung, and the next day gossip swirled. Was she a virgin? Did he perform well? Was the dowry truly earned? This was the first night of marriage in medieval times. Not moonlight and roses, not whispered promises, but a transaction sealed by a body, witnessed by strangers, and judged by a world that saw marriage not as love, but as structure, as economy, as law. So the next time we think of happily ever after, let us remember, for most people, in the medieval world, ever after began not with romance, but with a contract, a prayer, and sometimes someone watching from the shadows. In the medieval world, sex was never simply an act of love, desire, or even duty. It was an event wrapped in sacred codes, fearsome theology, and deeply embedded cultural beliefs. For people living during this time, especially across Christian Europe, the bedroom was not a private sanctuary. It was a place under surveillance, not by guards or kings, but by the church, the angels, and an ever-present spiritual morality. You see, sex was not your choice. It belonged to God, and therefore, even between a husband and wife, not all moments were permitted for intimacy. In fact, there were more moments when sex was forbidden than when it was allowed. Over 100 days, each year, were off limits. That's nearly 1/3 of the calendar, and in many communities, far more. Why? Because every part of life, including the most intimate, was seen through a spiritual lens. Bodies were not just flesh, they were vessels of purity or corruption. The timing of a kiss, the breath of a moan, even the presence of desire, could either honor God or invite demons. Certain periods of the year were considered sacred and demanded abstinence. Lent, those 40 days leading to Easter, was not just about fasting from food. It was about fasting from pleasure, including sex. Couples were expected to refrain completely, no matter how long they'd been apart or how deeply they loved one another. Advent, the season before Christmas, was similar. A time for reflection, not touch. Then came additional spiritual blocks, Rogation days, Ember days, the eve of major saints' feasts, and the 40 days after childbirth, known as the churching period, when a woman was considered spiritually impure. Add to this the weekly bans. Sex was not to be performed on Wednesdays, the day Judas betrayed Christ, Fridays, the day Christ was crucified, and Sundays, the Sabbath. That's 3 days every single week, over 150 days a year. Then there were additional no-go periods for any reason the church deemed impure. If a woman was menstruating, pregnant, nursing, had just given birth, or even suspected of being spiritually burdened, sex was off limits. In total, some scholars estimate that in many medieval communities, couples had fewer than 90 safe days a year. But this wasn't merely about following a calendar. These restrictions were powered by terror. People believed that violating the sacred timing of sex could lead to devastating consequences. The birth of a deformed child, the death of a spouse, crop failures, or divine punishment like fire, famine, or plague. Folk tales whispered that children conceived on forbidden nights were more likely to become heretics, criminals, or demon-possessed. In some towns, midwives would mark down the exact date of conception, cross-checking it with holy days to determine whether the child was born under clean or unclean circumstances. Confessors, priests who heard people's secrets, were trained to ask shockingly specific questions. Did you sleep with your wife on a Friday? Was she bleeding? Were you sober? Was it purely for reproduction? Because even within the safety of marriage, pleasure was deeply suspect. Desire, something we now see as human and natural, was, in the medieval mindset, wild, dangerous, and likely a tool of the devil. Sex done too eagerly, even between spouses, could be considered lustful and sinful. If a man sought his wife more than necessary to produce children, he might be seen as weak or perverse. If a woman initiated intimacy, she could be labeled wanton or cursed. Some writings of the time claimed that women were especially responsible for tempting men into breaking spiritual law, and that their very presence could draw men into sin if they weren't spiritually guarded. Entire treatises were written by monks detailing which sexual positions were most pure, missionary only, and which were sinful, everything else. There were even claims that sex in any position other than face-to-face invited demonic spirits into the room. Now imagine being a young couple, married just a few months, finally alone in a modest stone house with a fire glowing low. They lie, together, hands brushing. He wants her. She wants him. But it's Friday, and the church bell tolls outside. Is that God warning them? Is it a test? She whispers. We should wait. He nods, eyes clouded with frustration. In the morning, they'll confess the very thought. In this world, desire was not something to follow. It was something to control, punish, fear, and confess. What's more tragic, or perhaps more haunting, is that many of these people were not cruel or repressed by choice. They loved deeply, longed earnestly, and believed sincerely. They did not hate pleasure. They feared it. They feared that love could bring wrath. That closeness could bring death. That warmth could call down the cold hand of divine judgment. And so they taught themselves to be silent, to be still, to sleep beside someone they adored, without ever touching them, for nights, for weeks, sometimes months at a time. In the medieval mind, the soul was always at stake. Every act, especially sex, was part of a spiritual war, and in that war, even love had to wait. In the medieval world, the concept of cleanliness was vastly different from ours. Bathing as a daily ritual simply didn't exist for most people. In fact, for large stretches of the Middle Ages, especially from the 11th century onward, full-body bathing was considered either unnecessary, dangerous, or even immoral. Medical theory at the time, rooted in Galenic ideas and the belief in the four bodily humours, suggested that bathing could weaken the body by opening the pores and allowing bad air or evil spirits to seep into the system. Too much cleanliness was, ironically, seen as a gateway to illness. And as the centuries passed, public bathhouses, once relatively common in cities like Paris, London, and Rome, began to be condemned by religious authorities as dens of immorality. They were places where men and women mingled semi-nude, sometimes even sharing tubs. And over time, the church saw them as a threat to virtue, The rise of plagues and sexually transmitted diseases also played a role in their decline. Slowly but surely, public bathing fell out of favor, especially in more conservative Christian regions, and washing became more of a spot cleaning affair than a full-body ritual. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, seduction did not disappear. On the contrary, in a world so devoid of overt physical intimacy, the act of seduction became all the more powerful, subtle, and emotionally intense. Without the distractions of nudity or modern standards of hygiene, attraction lived in the in-between spaces. In glances, in gestures, in layers of fabric, in the hushed moments between words. Clothing played a vital role in this dance. Medieval fashion involved layers, linen chemises, woolen tunics, embroidered outer garments, belts, cloaks, head coverings. These weren't just functional. They were part of one's identity, social class, and personal appeal. A glimpse of a woman's ankle as she lifted her skirt to cross a muddy path could ignite more fascination than any modern swimsuit. A loose strand of hair escaping from beneath a wimple could be considered wildly sensual. Modesty created mystery, and mystery created desire. For the nobility and upper classes, this sense of longing evolved into the highly ritualized tradition of courtly love, a poetic and emotional relationship that often involved an unattainable lady and a devoted male admirer. In this world, love was expressed through song, poetry, symbolic gestures, and the exchange of tokens like gloves, rings, or laces. Physical contact was minimal or even forbidden, which only intensified the emotional hunger. A knight might write for years to a lady he could never touch. A woman might weep over a single flower sent by her lover before he rode off to war. In this paradoxically dirty and emotionally charged world, cleanliness wasn't necessary for seduction. Longing was. Among the common folk, peasants, artisans, servants, seduction was a bit more direct, but no less powerful. People lived in tight spaces, often sharing a single room with family members, animals, and neighbors. Privacy was a fantasy. Yet, even in these cramped conditions, moments were stolen. During seasonal festivals, village dances, and religious processions, people met and flirted. They exchanged whispers in barns, behind market stalls, in the shadows of stone churches. A man might brush a woman's hand while handing her apples. A girl might tie a small sprig of rosemary into a boy's cloak. These tiny acts meant something. Smell, despite the lack of modern soap or perfume, was part of the equation. People scented their hair and clothes with herbs, lavender, thyme, mint, and rose petals, either sewn into sachets or boiled and rubbed on the body. Wealthier, individuals used oils or vinegar-based washes to clean the face and hands. While full-body cleanliness was rare, people still took pride in their appearance, doing what they could with the tools and traditions of their time. And let's not forget, many medieval people were physically impressive. Life was physically demanding. Men and women worked from sun-up to sundown, ploughing fields, carrying heavy buckets, weaving, baking, riding, climbing. There were no gyms, but strength was built naturally. Calloused hands, sun-darkened skin, wind-burned cheeks. These weren't flaws. They were marks of resilience. A man didn't have to wear cologne if he could chop wood with one swing of an axe. A woman didn't need foundation if she could knead bread for a household and sing to a child all at once. Even among the higher classes, baths were rare. Queens and noblewomen might bathe a few times a year with rosewater or goat's milk, attended by maids. Kings might be washed on coronation days or when recovering from illness. But even the most powerful people of the time often relied on linen shirts and herbs to absorb sweat and odor. Yet love still happened. People still found one, another beautiful. Passion still bloomed under cloaks, behind curtains, and inside hearts. There were love letters, secret pregnancies, forbidden affairs, and marriages forged not just by family strategy, but true affection. None of it was clean, but all of it was real. So, while today we may wrinkle our noses at the idea of medieval bodies wrapped in wool and sweat, we must understand that for them, love and desire weren't dulled by dirt. They were intensified by distance. Where there was less to see, there was more to imagine. And where there was less to touch, there was more to long for. In the end, the scarcity of cleanliness only made the seduction deeper, more patient, more poetic, and, in its own way, more timeless. In the hushed stillness of medieval nights, in stone-walled rooms lit only by flickering candlelight or the faint silver glow of the moon, intimacy was not only cloaked in shadows, but in layers of linen, shame, superstition, and fear. The now notorious sex shirt, or nightgown with a single hole cut strategically to allow for intercourse, might seem laughably prudish or almost absurd to modern sensibilities. But to fully understand why it existed and how widespread its usage was, one must step into the medieval mindset, where religion was not just part of life, it was life. It governed the soul, the body, and even the bedroom. In this deeply Christianized worldview, sex was seen as both a sacred obligation and a spiritual threat. It was the paradox of the flesh, necessary for the continuation of humanity, yet dangerously pleasurable, potentially sinful, and constantly monitored by both earthly priests and heavenly eyes. The sex shirt was born from this contradiction. It was not always a literal, mass-produced garment, but rather a practice, a style of undress that allowed just enough exposure for procreation and no more. In some monastic or highly devout communities, it was custom for married couples to wear a simple shift with a hole cut at the genitals, leaving the rest of the body modestly covered. The goal was clear: minimize pleasure, maximize modesty, and protect the soul from lustful temptation. To show too much of one's body, even to a lawful spouse, was considered dangerous, not just socially indecent, but spiritually corrupting. Medieval theologians wrote in dense volumes about the dangers of carnal desire, warning that even married people could fall into sin if they enjoyed themselves too much or deviated from the proper purpose, reproduction. Modesty in the bedroom wasn't just preferred, it was demanded. The idea of undressing fully for sex was scandalous in many religious circles, and some priests warned couples during confession against unnecessary nakedness. Touching, kissing, eye contact during the act, even certain positions, could be labeled sinful. Sex was not a conversation between lovers, it was a contract with God. It had to be done in a way that upheld Christian virtue, avoided unnecessary pleasure, and preserved the humility of the soul. The sex shirt served as a kind of spiritual armor, a barrier between the temptation of the flesh and the purity of purpose. But this odd garment also had practical and cultural roots. Medieval homes were cold, damp, and lacked privacy. Most people slept in shared spaces with extended family, servants, or even farm animals. Doors were rare, curtains acted as walls. To be naked in this environment was not only uncomfortable, it was risky. The shirt provided warmth and a way to maintain personal dignity, especially when beds were shared by multiple people and anyone might roll over and wake. And beyond practicality, there was the overwhelming fear of demonic influence. Medieval belief systems warned of demons like incubi and succubi, who preyed on exposed, sleeping bodies, particularly those in a state of lust or desire. By keeping themselves covered, even during sex, people believed they could shield themselves from spiritual attack. A sex shirt wasn't just a modesty garment, it was a kind of talisman, a defense against unseen dangers lurking in the night. Women in particular bore the heavy burden of modesty and control. Female desire was viewed as both more dangerous and more easily ignited. The church taught that women were the descendants of Eve, whose curiosity and appetite had doomed mankind. A woman who appeared to enjoy sex was viewed with suspicion, sometimes even accused of witchcraft or devilish influence. Thus, the sex shirt became a silent signal of obedience and submission. A woman who kept herself covered, silent and still, who endured rather than participated, was seen as virtuous. She protected not only her own soul, but her husband's, by refusing to arouse him with her body or behavior. In this logic, seduction within marriage was dangerous. It made the holy act unholy. By wearing the shirt, she could perform her duty while preserving both of their spiritual purity. For men too, the shirt could be a test of restraint. They were expected to control their desires, to approach the act with reverence rather than passion. In confessionals, priests asked probing, intimate questions. Did you look at your wife with lust? Did you remove your clothing? Did you finish too quickly or take too much pleasure? Entire moral treatises were written warning about sinful sex, even within the bounds of marriage. Some clergy even suggested designated days when sex was permitted, and others when it was strictly forbidden, including Sundays, feast days, fasting days, and even during menstruation or pregnancy. In such a landscape, the act of sex became a minefield of potential sins, and the sex shirt became a way to tiptoe through it, reluctantly, quietly, and fully clothed. But despite all these restrictions, the layers of cloth, the pressure of religious guilt, the fear of damnation, desire still lived. People still longed for each other. Love still happened. There were giggles behind closed shutters, whispered promises in the dark, stolen kisses in haylofts, and secret rendezvous far from the watchful eyes of priests. Some couples defied the rules, not loudly, but with quiet acts of rebellion. They touched, they looked, they removed the shirt. For others, the sex shirt may have provided a strange kind of comfort, a way to engage in something terrifying with a measure of safety. Because to be naked in the Middle Ages wasn't just about physical exposure. It meant vulnerability to sin, disease, scandal, even social ruin. The shirt was more than fabric. It was psychological armor, a way to remain clothed in dignity, even while doing something deeply human. So when we look back at this strange single-hold garment, we're not just looking at a relic of prudery. We're looking at a symbol of an age obsessed with the body and the soul, with temptation and restraint, with pleasure and punishment. The sex shirt tells us how medieval people navigated the dangerous terrain between love and fear, between faith and flesh. It's easy to mock from a modern perspective, but in their world, shadowed by plague, poverty, and judgment, it made a kind of sense. Underneath it all, quite literally, was a very human need to love, to connect, to touch, even if you had to do it through cloth and caution, even in the dark. When we peer into the world of medieval contraception, we're not just exploring a forgotten chapter of history. We're entering a surreal realm shaped by desperation, folklore, misunderstood, science, and the suffocating grip of religious dogma. In a society where women bore the burden of constant pregnancies, often with little medical support, and where childbirth was frequently fatal, controlling fertility wasn't a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life, death, and dignity. And yet, the official teachings of the Church viewed contraception not only as sinful, but as a direct defiance of God's will. In this spiritual and social minefield, women did what they had to, secretly, courageously, and often bizarrely. Among the many strange methods whispered from mother to daughter, or passed down through generations of midwives and herbalists, one stands out for its sheer peculiarity: the use of dried weasel testicles as a contraceptive charm. Worn around the thigh, waist, or even the neck, these tiny talismans were believed to possess mystical powers to ward off pregnancy. The belief stemmed from the strange reputation of the weasel in medieval natural philosophy. According to the bestiaries and pseudo-scientific texts of the time, the weasel was thought to conceive through the ear or without sexual intercourse, a curious blend of myth, misobservation, and symbolic thinking. In a world where the line between science and magic was thin and blurry, it was logical, to them, that this animal's reproductive mystery could somehow be harnessed and transferred to women. This was part of a larger system of sympathetic magic, where like influences like. If an animal could avoid pregnancy or give birth in secret ways, its body, or even its essence, could potentially offer the same power to humans. Thus, dried animal parts, ground bones, or even menstrual blood found their way into amulets, brews, or poultices. Weasel testicles, in particular, symbolized both fertility and its negation, a rare and potent combination in the folk imagination. Some women wore them tied in small pouches made of linen or leather. Others sewed them into their undergarments. These charms weren't accessories, they were tools of survival, as meaningful to them as medicine or prayer. And yet, medieval contraceptive practices extended far beyond weasel parts. Women experimented with dozens of herbal remedies, many of which modern science has since confirmed as having contraceptive or abortifacient properties. Plants like pennyroyal, rue, silphium, and Queen Anne's lace were brewed into teas, ground into powders, or inserted directly into the vagina. Others used mixtures of vinegar, olive oil, honey, or wool soaked in herbs, hoping to create a physical and chemical barrier to conception. These methods were not always safe. In fact, many were toxic in the wrong doses. But they were practiced widely, particularly among poor and rural women who had little access to alternative forms of care. The knowledge of such practices was often handed down in secret, from older women to younger, kept out of sight from priests and husbands alike. Midwives, some of the few women with recognized authority in their communities, were often the keepers of these forbidden traditions. But with that knowledge came risk. In times of social upheaval, famine, or religious fervor, these same women were the first to be accused of witchcraft. To seek control over fertility was to claim authority over one's body, something the patriarchy and the church both deeply feared. So the woman who wore the dried weasel testicle was not merely trying to prevent pregnancy. She was resisting an entire system that denied her bodily autonomy. It's important to recognize just how radical this was. In a time when the official doctrine taught that sex must always remain open to life, and that female pleasure or control was inherently suspect, contraception was both a rebellion and a risk. Women could be punished severely for even attempting to control their reproductive fate. Inquisition records, ecclesiastical courts, and confession manuals are filled with accounts of women interrogated, humiliated, or punished for using unnatural methods to avoid pregnancy. The church declared such acts as interfering with God's divine plan. But for many women, the alternative, endless cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and child loss, was simply too much to bear. Weasel testicles may sound absurd, today a relic of superstition and backward thinking, but to mock them is to overlook the truth behind them. They represent a desperate, ingenious attempt by women to navigate a world that gave them no control over their lives or bodies. These practices, strange as they were, tell us something powerful. Medieval women were not passive. They were observant, resourceful. They watched nature. They experimented. They whispered secrets. They protected each other. And they fought, in whatever ways they could, for some sliver of control over their fate. In every dried testicle charm, in every bitter herbal tea, in every hidden ritual, we find not just oddity, but resistance. The resistance of women who were told they were vessels and nothing more. The resistance of mothers who'd lost too many children. The resistance of lovers who wanted more than duty. And the resistance of human beings who, even in the darkest corners of history, tried to say, "This body is mine." In medieval Europe, the grip of the church extended into nearly every aspect of life, from the rhythms of the workday to the rituals of birth, death, and everything in between. And nowhere was its control more aggressively asserted than over the human body, especially its desires. According to official doctrine, physical pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure, was a corruption of the soul, a dangerous temptation that could pull even the most pious off the path of salvation. Church leaders taught that sex was acceptable only within marriage and strictly for the purpose of reproduction. Anything more, any act tinged with desire, affection, or personal satisfaction, was to be condemned as lustful, carnal, and ultimately sinful. But beneath this austere theology lived a far more complicated and far more human reality. Because in truth, nobody really followed that rule quietly. Certainly not the peasants, whose hard lives were punctuated by moments of joy, mischief, and intimacy, and not the nobility, whose courts were often bubbling with secret affairs and coded romance. Even among the clergy, there were those who preached chastity by day and broke their vows by night. Behind the stone walls of monasteries and convents, and within the wooden cottages of humble villages, people whispered, loved, desired, and touched, often in ways that defied the sermons they heard on Sunday. The contradiction was everywhere. While priests thundered from pulpits about the sin of lust, the people wrote love poetry, some of it shockingly explicit, and sang folk songs about longing and seduction. Troubadours traveled from court to court, spinning tales of forbidden, passion, and romantic defiance. Manuscripts and marginalia revealed cheeky illustrations, sometimes even bordering on the erotic, drawn by bored scribes or rebellious monks. In towns and cities, brothels operated openly, sometimes even with the reluctant approval of local authorities, who saw them as a necessary evil to protect the virtue of respectable women. In London and Paris, entire districts were known for their houses of pleasure, many of them tax-paying institutions. For common people, sexual pleasure wasn't just a sinful indulgence, it was part of life. In a world where entertainment was scarce, where marriages were often arranged and economic pressure was unrelenting, love and intimacy offered brief moments of freedom. Young people met at festivals, under maypoles, at taverns, or in the shadows of feast days. Premarital sex happened, affairs happened, and while punishment was possible, especially for women, communities often looked the other way, or at least dealt with it quietly through marriage arrangements or private shaming, rather than public trials. Even within marriage, pleasure was quietly acknowledged, though never loudly celebrated. Medical texts of the time admitted that female pleasure was necessary for conception, a belief that gave women at least a small excuse to seek enjoyment. Husbands and wives found ways to be intimate even within the suffocating structure of religious rules. Some couples shared deep bonds of love and partnership. Others conducted double lives, maintaining respectability while pursuing passion elsewhere. Letters between medieval lovers show tenderness, longing, erotic imagination, none of which matched the cold, functional tone of church teachings. And within the church itself, there was hypocrisy. Monks who took vows of chastity were sometimes caught in scandal, with women, with men, with each other. Some maintained long-term lovers, even secret families. There are countless records of priests being fined, relocated, or quietly reassigned after being discovered in moral failings. Some bishops maintained mistresses openly. In convents too, love blossomed. Between nuns and priests, between cloistered, women and outsiders who found ways to sneak in. The walls of the church were thick, but human desire found cracks in every corner. Behind all this was a more profound truth. The church's teaching on pleasure was never just about sin, it was about control. To regulate sex was to regulate bodies. To declare pleasure sinful was to claim authority over the most personal part of a person's life, their most intimate moments, thoughts, and instincts. Pleasure was dangerous, not only because it might lead people away from prayer, but because it offered autonomy. In moments of desire, people remembered that they were human, that they could feel joy, connection, and vulnerability outside the grip of the institution. And yet, people did not stop. They adapted. They hid. They confessed, were punished, and sinned again. They whispered secrets. They wrote poems in the margins of holy books. They touched when they weren't supposed to. They lived double lives. They fell in love. They laughed in the face of guilt or wept after midnight prayers. They lived. So while the church may have preached that pleasure was sinful, it never fully succeeded in stamping it out, because human beings, even in the most repressive of eras, will always seek closeness, intimacy, and connection, even when it's forbidden, especially when it's forbidden. In the harsh, hierarchical society of medieval Europe, where women were often treated as second-class citizens both legally and spiritually, their bodies became battlegrounds of fear, control, and projection. And nothing evoked more unease in the male-dominated church and society than the idea of a woman desiring, enjoying, or even initiating sexual pleasure. While male pleasure was accepted, even quietly encouraged in taverns, courts, and among soldiers, female pleasure was a different story altogether. It was taboo, it was threatening, and worst of all, it was mysterious. Because in a culture that believed women should be passive, silent, and submissive, a woman's agency over her own body, especially her capacity to feel and enjoy it, was seen as a crack in the patriarchal order, something to be corrected or punished. This fear wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Theologians and philosophers, many of whom had never known a woman intimately, theorized obsessively about the dangers of her pleasure. Church fathers like Augustine and Tertullian spoke of women as the gateway to the devil, associating Eve's temptation in the Garden of Eden with every act of female autonomy, especially sexual. They believed that women, if not strictly controlled, would lead men astray, not only morally, but spiritually. In their minds, a woman who wanted sex was unnatural, her desire was suspect, and her pleasure, that was something close to diabolical. It meant she wasn't just submitting, she was enjoying, she was participating, and that, in their worldview, was a threat to the entire moral fabric of society. The terror didn't end at theology, it filtered directly into witchcraft accusations. Starting in the late Middle Ages, and especially during the witch hunts of the 15th to 17th centuries, women who exhibited sexual independence or vitality were often accused of being in league with the devil. Many were charged with engaging in carnal acts with demons, a twisted symbolic punishment for having dared to own their desire. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, a guidebook for hunting witches, explicitly stated that women were more lustful than men, that their sexuality was wild and uncontainable, and that they were therefore more likely to consort with Satan. It argued that witches gained their powers through sex with the devil, a grotesque fantasy rooted not in truth, but in male anxiety about female pleasure. In these twisted beliefs, a woman's climax was interpreted not as a moment of mutual intimacy, but as evidence of spiritual corruption. Many trials included horrifying questions about a woman's body, her behavior in bed, her relationships, and her supposed unnatural desires. If she was unmarried and happy, she was suspicious. If she was married but didn't bear children, she was suspicious. If she enjoyed sex, she was especially suspicious. The simple act of enjoying her own body could be seen as proof that she had made a pact with dark forces. Even outside of witchcraft, this suspicion of female pleasure shaped daily life. Midwives, who often knew how to ease childbirth or how to stimulate pleasure for conception, a then common belief, were targeted for their knowledge. Women who used herbs to enhance intimacy or regulate their cycles, sometimes for pleasure, sometimes to avoid pregnancy, were often accused of sorcery. Knowledge of the female body, when possessed by a woman, was dangerous. Medical knowledge was acceptable only when it came from men. The rest was witchcraft. And so, generation after generation, women were taught that their pleasure was dirty, sinful, shameful, or even criminal. Girls were raised to believe their value lay in their silence, their modesty, their obedience. A woman who expressed desire was often branded a harlot. A wife who sought pleasure could be seen as disrespectful or insatiable. Society punished women not just for actions, but for sensations. And yet, despite it all, women still felt, they still loved, they still wanted, in hidden spaces, in sisterhoods, in whispered conversations, in secret writings and folk songs. Women shared what little they could about their bodies, their feelings, their hopes. Older women taught younger ones the truths the church wouldn't speak. They passed down recipes for herbal teas, symbols stitched into clothing for protection, and silent gestures of support. Pleasure, when it came, was often private, cautious, unspoken. But it did come, because the body remembers what society tries to erase. Because desire, especially when repressed, becomes fierce. So yes, in medieval times, women's pleasure was seen as suspicious, not because it was wrong, but because it represented power. The power to choose, to feel, to resist. And to a society built on male authority and spiritual obedience, that power was intolerable. But pleasure, once awakened, is hard to silence. Even in the darkest centuries, it flickered quietly in women's lives. A private rebellion, a secret truth, a whisper of freedom beneath layers of fear. In countless historical societies across the globe, the concept of virginity, particularly for women, transcended personal intimacy to become a deeply entrenched, often brutal, public obsession. Far from a private matter between individuals, a woman's virginity was frequently considered a tangible asset, a crucial marker of her family's honor, social standing, and economic security. This intense societal fixation meant that demonstrable proof of virginity was frequently demanded, sometimes through the most invasive and psychologically harrowing rituals imaginable. None perhaps stands out with such stark clarity as the ritualistic display of stained bedsheets the morning after a wedding night, a custom that vividly illustrates the extreme lengths to which societies went to control female bodies and ensure patriarchal lineage. The profound roots of this obsession were deeply intertwined with both religious dogma and socio-economic structures. For centuries, major Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have, in varying degrees, emphasized premarital chastity and purity, often condemning fornication as a grave sin. This moral framework provided a powerful spiritual justification for societal control over female sexuality. Parallel to this, the pragmatic concerns of patriarchal systems saw women as crucial conduits for the transmission of property and power. A virgin bride was the ultimate guarantee of legitimate heirs, preventing potential disputes over inheritance and maintaining the integrity of family bloodlines. In an era where primogeniture and dynastic succession were paramount, particularly among noble and aristocratic families, an undisputed lineage was not just desirable, but essential for stability and influence. To introduce a non-virgin into a marriage could invite scandal, public dishonor, and even the annulment of the union, casting an indelible shadow of shame over an entire family's reputation and jeopardizing their standing within the community. Society, in its relentless pursuit of order and control, viewed unchecked female sexuality as a potential source of chaos and subversion of the established hierarchy. This pervasive societal pressure culminated in the often dreaded and highly ritualized inspection of the nuptial sheets. The morning after the wedding, typically the female elders of both families, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, and sometimes even a select group of trusted female neighbors or community members, would gather to scrutinize the bed linens. The expectation was starkly clear. Visible evidence of a bloodstain, indicating the rupture of the bride's hymen during consummation. This blood was considered irrefutable proof of her virginity, signifying her purity and the successful, legitimate beginning of the marital union. A successful display would be met with profound relief, sometimes even public celebration, affirming the bride's honor and, by extension, the untainted reputation of both her immediate and marital families. It was a tangible validation, a collective, societal sigh of satisfaction that deeply ingrained expectations had been met and moral order maintained. While the specific manifestations varied, this practice was present in various forms across medieval Europe, parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and certain regions of Asia, highlighting its widespread cultural significance. However, this deeply ingrained practice was built upon a fundamentally flawed understanding of female anatomy, leading to immense psychological distress and devastating social consequences for women. Medically, the hymen is far from a reliable indicator of virginity, It is a thin, often elastic membrane that can be broken by a myriad of non-sexual activities, including rigorous sports, the insertion of tampons, or even common physical activities during childhood. Furthermore, some women are born with very little hymenal tissue, or it may be naturally very pliable and not tear or bleed during initial intercourse. Many women simply do not bleed during their first sexual encounter, a biological reality that was largely ignored or misunderstood in historical contexts. The absence of blood, therefore, was not medical proof of prior sexual activity, but was almost universally interpreted as evidence of a fallen woman. This fundamental misunderstanding created an unbearable burden of anxiety for brides. They faced not only the pressure of their wedding night, but the crushing weight of public scrutiny and the potential for utter ruin if their bodies did not perform according to a false standard. Stories, both historical and anecdotal, speak to the desperate measures some women took to fake the evidence, from pricking their fingers to using animal blood or other deceptive tricks, driven by the intense pressure and the dire consequences of failure. An unlucky bride, one whose hymen did not bleed, faced accusations of promiscuity, profound public shame, social ostracism, the annulment of her marriage, and often a life of social ruin. Her family, too, would suffer ignominy and a stain on their honor that could affect future marriage prospects for their other children. The act of sex, designed to be intimate, was transformed into a public examination, a performance with catastrophic stakes. The public obsession with virginity, so graphically symbolized by the bedsheet ritual, offers a stark illustration of the profound lack of female agency and bodily autonomy in historical contexts. Women's bodies were not their own. They were seen as vessels for lineage, symbols of family honor, and objects to be controlled and managed by male authority. Their sexuality was not for their pleasure or self-expression, but rather a commodity to be protected and delivered intact to secure legitimate offspring and maintain patriarchal structures. This system generated immense anxiety, fear, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability, confining women within rigid social and moral boundaries. The constant scrutiny and the ever-present threat of public shaming served as powerful mechanisms of social control, reinforcing traditional gender roles and limiting women's participation and influence outside the domestic sphere. While the explicit display of bloody bedsheets has largely faded in most parts of the world, consigned to the history books and ethnographic studies, its historical echo persists. The legacy of valuing female virginity above all else continues to subtly influence contemporary attitudes towards women's sexuality in many cultures. Concepts like purity culture, the persistence of slut-shaming, and the enduring double standards where male promiscuity is often excused while female promiscuity is condemned are all echoes of this historical obsession. Even in societies that pride themselves on their modern and progressive values, remnants of these ancient anxieties about female sexual purity can still shape social norms, personal judgments, and even public policy regarding reproductive rights and sexual education. In conclusion, the historical reality that virginity was a public obsession, often proven by stained bedsheets, underscores a profound chapter in human social history. It reveals the extraordinary lengths to which societies went to control female sexuality, ensure lineage, and maintain social order. It was a system built on biological misinformation and perpetuated by deep-seated patriarchal and religious beliefs. This insight reminds us that virginity was never merely a private affair. It was a powerful public spectacle with life-altering consequences, a poignant illustration of how deeply societal expectations could penetrate the most intimate aspects of human existence. Got it. Apologies again for the previous shortfalls. I will now generate a comprehensive script for point 2. Romance was whispered in Latin, hidden in poems, or carved in secret into wood and stone, aiming to exceed the 1,000-word count with rich historical detail and extensive examples. The secret language of love, whispers, poems, and hidden carvings in times of constraint. In many historical epochs, the grand, overt declarations of love that populate our modern romance novels were not just uncommon, but often outright impossible. Instead, romance was a clandestine affair, a delicate, intricate dance performed largely in the shadows, its true sentiments often whispered in Latin, hidden within the delicate lines of poems, or painstakingly carved in secret into enduring wood and stone. This wasn't merely a quaint social custom or a matter of personal shyness. Rather, it was a profound adaptation to societies rigorously governed by stringent social norms, rigid religious doctrines, and deeply entrenched class structures. These powerful forces frequently dictated that any overt emotional displays, especially those hinting at illicit passions, personal choice in matrimony, or affections outside of prescribed arrangements, were simply not permissible and could even invite severe social or legal repercussions. Love, therefore, was compelled to find its expression through a nuanced lexicon of codes, subtle gestures, and veiled communications, forming a secret language understood only by those privileged or daring enough to decipher it. One of the most powerful and sophisticated vehicles for this veiled affection was undoubtedly Latin. For well over a millennium, from the decline of the Roman Empire through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, Latin was far more than just the language of the church, law, and academia. It was the lingua franca of the educated elite across much of Europe. Its strategic deployment in romantic contexts served multiple, crucial purposes. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, it offered unparalleled discretion and security. A love letter, a passionate verse, or an intimate note scribbled in Latin could easily pass for a scholarly commentary, a legal document, or a religious text to the uninitiated eye. This afforded a crucial layer of protection, safeguarding both the writer and the recipient from the prying eyes of suspicious family members, nosy servants, or moralistic authorities who might otherwise condemn their illicit connection. Secondly, the use of Latin lent an immediate air of intellectual sophistication and cultivated refinement to the message. It implied a shared intellectual world, a secret society of two minds, elevating the romance beyond mere carnal desire to a realm of intellectual and spiritual communion. This coded communication became a testament to a unique bond, a shared understanding accessible only to those with the education and wit to pass its layers. Furthermore, Latin provided a peculiar blend of anonymity and timelessness. Passages from classical Roman poets like Ovid, Catullus, or Horace, brimming with sensuality and heartfelt longing, could be borrowed, adapted, or subtly alluded to. Even newly composed verses crafted in the ancient tongue allowed for deep feelings to be conveyed without directly incriminating the author, as the words themselves seem to echo from a distant past, lending a degree of plausible deniability. A seemingly innocuous quote, a familiar phrase, or a cleverly repurposed line from an ancient text, its true passionate meaning only apparent to the one who held the key to their shared lexicon of inside jokes, specific literary references, or private understandings, became a potent symbol of their unique bond. Beyond the spoken or written word, poetry emerged as an indispensable and highly versatile medium for conveying hidden affections. Across diverse cultures and time periods, poets have consistently mastered the art of embedding profound emotion through the elegant use of metaphor, allegory, symbolism, and layered meanings. In societies where marriage was primarily a pragmatic arrangement, a strategic alliance of families, fortunes, and political power, personal affection and romantic love were often relegated to a secondary status or were merely expected to develop after the vows were exchanged. For those who experienced a deep, passionate love that defied these prescribed arrangements, poetry offered a vital, often subversive outlet. A meticulously crafted sonnet, a poignant ballad, a delicate lyric, or even a deceptively simple rhyme could secretly embed a fervent declaration of love, describe a longing glance, recall a cherished moment, or convey a private understanding that would utterly escape the notice of watchful parents, suspicious spouses, or disapproving society. These precious poems might be painstakingly copied and slipped into the pages of a favored book, subtly woven into the intricate designs of a tapestry, concealed within a piece of personal jewelry, or even simply memorized and recited in hushed tones during stolen moments. Their true intent was often veiled behind layers of literary convention, pastoral imagery, complex allegories, or the idealized, often emotionally detached, tropes of courtly love. The very act of composing or receiving such a poem was, in itself, an act of profound intimacy and quiet defiance, a testament to a love that dared not, or could not, speak its name openly, a love that required a secret garden of words to flourish. Even more enduring and arguably more desperate in their genesis were the declarations carved in secret into wood and stone. These were often anonymous, spontaneous, yet profoundly meaningful acts of devotion, left as indelible, almost defiant, marks on the landscape or within the privacy of concealed spaces. Imagine the interwoven initials of two lovers, painstakingly etched with a sharp blade or tool onto ancient church pews, behind crumbling castle walls, on a secluded tree trunk deep within a forgotten forest, or even on the underside of a personal desk. These were rarely grand public monuments. Rather, they were typically small, almost imperceptible etchings, a lover's initials intertwined with their beloved's, a specific date, a shared symbol, or perhaps a short, heartfelt phrase, often incomplete, or abbreviated to maintain secrecy. These hidden carvings represented a profound and often desperate desire for permanence and remembrance. In a world where love might be fleeting, forbidden, or unacknowledged, these physical marks were a silent scream of existence, a plea for their love, however ephemeral or illicit, to somehow be acknowledged and remembered. They were acts of quiet, rebellion against societal constraints, a yearning to leave a tangible testament to emotions that the world around them wished to suppress, deny, or simply ignore. Unlike transient whispered words or easily destroyed paper letters, these marks were intended to defy the ravages of time, a desperate hope that their love, however forbidden, would somehow outlive the social and moral strictures placed upon it, whispering their secret across centuries to any who might stumble upon them and understand. Ultimately, the compelling need for these secret expressions, through whispered Latin, carefully hidden poems, and enduring private carvings, underscored the profoundly restrictive nature of historical societies when it came to personal relationships and the unfettered expression of emotion. It painted a vivid picture of a world where genuine affection and authentic romantic love often had to be painstakingly concealed, nurtured in the deepest shadows, and communicated through a rich and complex tapestry of coded signals and symbolic gestures. These hidden romantic acts weren't merely about avoiding scandal or punishment. They were fundamentally about preserving the sanctity and authenticity of personal feeling, allowing love to breathe, flourish, and exist, even if only in the most covert, beautifully subtle, and eternally defiant ways. They stand as enduring testaments to the human spirit's indomitable capacity for love, even when faced with insurmountable social barriers. In the annals of history, the bedroom was often far from a private sanctuary of unbridled passion. For vast stretches of time, particularly throughout the Christianized West, it functioned more as a carefully regulated moral battleground. Here, intimate acts were strictly governed by an intricate web of religious dogma, rigid societal expectations, and even legal prescriptions. While today, the choice of sexual positions might be considered a matter of personal preference or mutual consent, in various historical periods, there were incredibly stringent rules for acceptable positions, with some deemed so profoundly transgressive, so demonstrably sinful, that they were considered grave offenses, demanding detailed confession and often severe penance. This intense scrutiny of intimacy wasn't merely about pleasure or procreation. It was fundamentally about control, purity, the very salvation of one's immortal soul, and the upholding of a divinely ordained social order, thereby transforming the most intimate act into a perilous minefield of spiritual damnation. The primary, overwhelming force behind these meticulously prescriptive sexual rules was, without question, the Church. Across centuries, from the ascetic pronouncements of the early church fathers, like St. Augustine and St. Jerome, through the intricate theological debates of medieval scholasticism, and continuing into the moral dictates of the Counter-Reformation, a remarkably consistent message emerged. Sexual intercourse was permissible primarily, if not exclusively, for the singular purpose of procreation. Any act within the marital bed that deviated from this sanctified purpose, or that seemed to overtly indulge in pure pleasure without the inherent potential for conception, was viewed with profound suspicion. Such acts were frequently branded as expressions of lust, an inherently sinful inclination that could lead the soul astray and invite divine wrath. This overarching theological stance laid the foundational groundwork for defining what constituted acceptable or natural sexual positions, casting a long shadow of judgment over any perceived deviations. Within this framework, the missionary position, where the man is on top and the woman is on her back, facing each other, ascended to the status of the preeminent and often solitary acceptable standard. It was deemed the natural, Christian, or even human position, precisely because it was believed to be the most conducive to conception, mimicking the natural order of human beings and facilitating the seed reaching its intended destination within the womb. Its naturalness was often argued from a teleological perspective, that is, that its very design pointed to its divine purpose. This explicit endorsement of one position implicitly and often explicitly condemned all others as unnatural, beastly, perverse, or even demonic, thereby creating a binary of sexual morality that was unforgiving in its judgment. The condemnation of alternative positions was multifaceted, often rooted in a combination of factors related to their perceived non-procreative nature or their association with what was deemed animalistic or unnatural behavior. Any position that placed the woman on top, for instance, was vehemently denounced. This was not merely about impeding procreation. It deeply reflected and reinforced the pervasive patriarchal power dynamics of the time. A woman positioned on top was seen as a grave inversion of the natural hierarchy, a direct challenge to male dominance, and a stark indication of unbridled female lust, assertiveness, or control, all of which were anathema to the prevailing social and religious order. Such a position might be scornfully labeled the riding position, the Amazon, or the woman on top position, inherently imbued with negative connotations of female usurpation and moral laxity. It was widely believed to incite excessive lust in both partners and to distract from the true, sacred, procreative purpose of the conjugal act. Even more vehemently condemned, almost universally across Christian theology, were anal S3X, often referred to as sodomy, and oral S3X. These acts were considered particularly grievous mortal sins. Their explicit non-procreative nature was a primary reason for their condemnation, as they were seen as wasting the seed or simply indulging in pleasure without purpose. Beyond this, they were often viewed as a profound perversion of the natural order, acts against nature that could incur the most severe divine wrath, threatening not just individual souls, but the moral fabric of entire communities. The severity of their condemnation meant they were not just personal transgressions, but threats to the very cosmic order. Some theologians even likened them to bestiality or heresy in their depravity, underscoring the extreme revulsion they evoked. The practical enforcement and policing of these strict rules fell largely to the institution of the confessional. For centuries, the sacrament of penance was not merely a means of seeking divine forgiveness, but also a formidable tool for social, moral, and even political regulation. Penitential manuals, meticulously compiled by confessors, detailed a vast and intricate array of sins, including highly specific and graphic descriptions of sexual transgressions. These manuals provided priests with standardized, often chillingly intrusive questions to ask parishioners, probing into the most intimate details of their private lives and conjugal relations. A penitent, trembling before their confessor, might be asked not just if they had committed a sin of lust, but how, which positions, with whom, to identify adultery or incest, and crucially, in what manner, with what degree of pleasure, or during forbidden times. For instance, specific questions might arise about whether intercourse occurred during periods of ritual prohibition, e.g., during Lent, Advent, on Sundays, feast days, or during a woman's menstruation or pregnancy, or if unnatural acts or positions were engaged in. The shame, guilt, and profound humiliation associated with confessing such unnatural or lustful acts were immense. The penitent would be compelled to explicitly describe their most private and often deeply embarrassing sins to a priest, a figure of unquestionable spiritual authority and God's representative on earth, often a celibate man bound by divine law to uphold these very moral codes. This process could be deeply invasive, psychologically terrifying, and profoundly humiliating, deliberately designed to instill pervasive remorse and thereby deter future transgressions. The act of confession itself became a form of psychological punishment. The spiritual and temporal penalties for these sexual sins varied but could be quite severe. Depending on the perceived gravity and frequency of the offense, penances ranged from prescribed periods of fasting and intensive prayer to more overt forms of public humiliation, and in some more extreme cases, even physical punishments or excommunication from the community. For instance, engaging in oral or anal S3X was consistently ranked among the most heinous of sexual transgressions, demanding the most stringent and lengthy penances. Even what we might consider today as seemingly minor deviations from the norm, such as prolonged foreplay, excessive passion, or mutual masturbation within marriage, could be considered venial sins if they were perceived to prioritize non-procreative pleasure over the sanctified act of procreation. The Church's pervasive power was such that the terrifying fear of eternal damnation, coupled with the immediate social stigma and the crushing burden of penance, effectively kept many individuals, at least outwardly, firmly within the narrow bounds of acceptable sexual conduct. However, it is crucial for a complete historical understanding to acknowledge the inherent gap between stringent prescription and messy, lived practice. While the Church and secular authorities laid down incredibly restrictive laws and moral injunctions, human nature, driven by desire, affection, and curiosity, often found ingenious ways to circumvent, ignore, or discreetly defy them. Not everyone adhered rigidly to these rules. Indeed, historical evidence from medical texts to legal records of punishments for sexual offenses suggests that a vibrant, if often clandestine, sexual culture existed beneath the surface of rigid moral pronouncements. Folk remedies, love potions, erotic art, and subtly suggestive literature from various periods subtly hint at a diversity of sexual practices and understandings that often belied official condemnations. Furthermore, the effectiveness and severity of the confessional varied widely. Some priests might have been more lenient or less intrusive in their questioning, while others were zealous to the point of obsession in their interrogation of private lives. Ultimately, the very privacy of the marriage bed itself offered a degree of personal autonomy, where couples might engage in acts they would never dare confess, risking their immortal souls but perhaps satisfying their desires in ways that transcended the rigid moral codes of their era. In conclusion, the historical obsession with acceptable sexual positions was a powerful and often oppressive reflection of broader societal and religious efforts to control human bodies, desires, and the very fabric of family and community. From the theological dictates of the Church Fathers to the intrusive interrogations within the confessional, an intricate and punishing web of rules sought to confine sexual expression to the narrowest parameters of procreation and specific, natural acts. This system generated immense anxiety, profound shame, and pervasive fear, transforming the most intimate moments into a rigorous test of faith, obedience, and moral conformity. While the overt policing of sexual positions has largely receded in many modern societies, the enduring historical legacy of these moral codes continues, subtly yet significantly, to influence contemporary attitudes towards sexuality, often shaping our understanding of what is considered normal, natural, perverse, or sinful in the bedroom, long after the immediate fear of public shaming or hellfire confessions has faded from everyday life. In the intimate and often terrifying world of medieval and early modern religious thought, even the most involuntary of bodily functions could become a source of profound spiritual anxiety and guilt. This was particularly true for men, who, after simply sleeping, might awaken to discover they had experienced a wet dream or nocturnal emission. Far from being understood as a natural physiological process, this common occurrence was frequently interpreted through a rigid theological lens, leading to immense shame and the deeply uncomfortable necessity for some men to confess these seemingly innocent acts in the confessional. This phenomenon vividly illustrates the pervasive reach of religious doctrine into the most private aspects of human existence, transforming an involuntary bodily function into a potential moral failing worthy of spiritual reckoning. The roots of this profound unease lay deep within the prevailing Christian theological framework, particularly in the emphasis on chastity, purity, and the dangers of lust. From the writings of early church fathers like St. Augustine, who wrestled profoundly with human sexuality and concupiscence, the inclination to sin, to the complex moral theology of the High Middle Ages, sexual desire, even in its absence of conscious intent, was often viewed with suspicion. The involuntary emission of semen was problematic for several reasons. Firstly, it represented a wasting of seed outside of the procreative act, which, as discussed with sexual positions, was a grave concern. Semen was considered a vital, precious fluid, not to be expended without purpose. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, nocturnal emissions were often associated with unconscious lust or impure thoughts. Even if the man was asleep, the emission implied that his mind, even in slumber, harbored some form of carnal desire, making him complicit in a sin of thought or imagination. This concept was particularly vexing because it blurred the lines between involuntary bodily function and moral culpability, placing men in a theological bind. The prevailing medical and scientific understanding of the time, or rather the lack thereof, further exacerbated this anxiety. Without a modern understanding of endocrinology or sleep cycles, nocturnal emissions were often attributed to various causes, some mundane, others deeply spiritual. Dietary excesses, particularly rich or hot foods, were sometimes blamed for stimulating the body. However, the more troubling explanations linked them directly to demonic temptation or residual lust. It was widely believed that demons, incubi in particular, could visit men in their sleep, inducing erotic dreams and emissions to tempt them into sin or even to steal their seed for diabolical purposes. This made the experience terrifying. Was it a natural bodily function, a consequence of one's own impure thoughts, or an attack by malevolent spiritual forces? This ambiguity fueled immense personal distress. The burden of this ambiguity often fell upon the institution of the confessional. For a medieval or early modern man, the act of experiencing a wet dream, especially if accompanied by a vivid dream of a sexual nature, could trigger intense anxiety about the state of his soul. He might genuinely believe he had sinned either through conscious thought preceding sleep, or through the impure nature of the dream itself, or simply by the waste of semen. Therefore, driven by guilt and the overwhelming desire to remain in a state of grace, especially before receiving communion, men would approach their confessors with this deeply personal and embarrassing dilemma. Confessors, armed with their penitential manuals, were trained to interrogate parishioners on a wide range of sins, including those of lust and impurity. While some manuals might distinguish between voluntary and involuntary actions, the line was often blurry when it came to sexual matters. A priest might ask detailed questions. Did you take pleasure in the dream? Did you invite these thoughts during the day? Was there any willful consent, even partial, to the impurity? The penitent, already shamed by the mere occurrence, would then have to articulate the humiliating details of his nighttime experience to a celibate priest who represented divine authority. This process was profoundly uncomfortable. The man might struggle to explain that he was entirely unconscious, yet the very act of describing it made it feel more real, more sinful. The theological debate around wet dreams was complex and often contradictory among scholars themselves. Some theologians argued for leniency, positing that if the emission was truly involuntary and without any preceding sinful thought or act, it was not a sin. However, even these more lenient interpretations often placed conditions. The man must not have engaged in any willful, lustful thoughts during the day, nor should he have overeaten or drunk excessively, which might predispose him to such dreams. Other, more rigid interpretations viewed any emission, even nocturnal, as a form of impurity that required ritual cleansing, or at the very least, confession and penance before one could receive the Eucharist. This conservative view often stemmed from Old Testament purity laws regarding seminal emissions, which, though largely ritualistic, were sometimes misapplied to Christian moral theology. The psychological impact on men was considerable. Imagine waking in the morning, finding physical evidence of a wet dream, and immediately feeling a wave of shame, guilt, and fear for your immortal soul. This wasn't just a fleeting embarrassment. For devout men, it was a profound spiritual crisis. It could lead to scrupulousness, where men became overly anxious about sin, constantly scrutinizing their thoughts and dreams. They might impose upon themselves self-flagellation, prolonged fasting, or other forms of penance, even if their confessor offered absolution, feeling that they needed to purge themselves of this impurity. The simple act of sleeping, a necessity for human life, became a potential pathway to sin and spiritual distress, eroding peace of mind and fostering a constant state of self-surveillance. Moreover, the confession of nocturnal emissions highlights a broader theme: the Church's pervasive control over individual bodies and thoughts. By extending moral culpability even to unconscious bodily functions, religious authorities sought to regulate not just outward behavior, but internal states, including thoughts, desires, and dreams. This created a culture where personal intimacy, even that experienced in sleep, was subject to external judgment and spiritual evaluation. It blurred the lines between accident and intent, between physiology and morality, leading to immense psychological burdens for individuals striving to live a virtuous life. In conclusion, the historical phenomenon of men confessing wet dreams in shame after simply sleeping offers a poignant window into the intense moral pressures of historical societies, fueled by theological understandings that viewed seminal emissions as potentially sinful waste or evidence of unconscious lust, and compounded by a lack of modern scientific knowledge. This involuntary bodily function became a source of profound spiritual anxiety. The confessional, intended for absolution, became a site of profound humiliation, as men were forced to articulate the most private of experiences to their spiritual guides. This practice underscores the deep reach of religious authority into personal lives and the significant psychological burden it placed on individuals. While today we understand nocturnal emissions as a natural part of male physiology, their historical interpretation serves as a powerful reminder of how deeply religious doctrine could shape perceptions of the body, sin, and the anxious quest for spiritual purity. In an era largely devoid of formal medical education, where physicians were almost exclusively male and often lacked practical experience with female anatomy and childbirth, midwives stood as the only real experts in matters concerning women's bodies, particularly S3X and fertility. These remarkable women, often illiterate but possessing generations of accumulated wisdom, occupied a unique and indispensable role in communities. They were the silent guardians of a vast, practical knowledge base, quietly passing down essential S3X and fertility information from woman to woman, bypassing formal institutions and creating an invaluable, informal network of support and expertise that was vital for female health and well-being. The pervasive lack of official medical care for women, especially for intimate concerns, created a vacuum that midwives instinctively filled. Male physicians of the past trained in universities that emphasized classical texts over clinical practice, often viewed childbirth and women's health with a mixture of theoretical detachment and sometimes outright disdain. They rarely attended births, considering it too messy or beneath their dignity. Their understanding of female anatomy and reproductive processes was often theoretical, gleaned from ancient texts rather than hands-on experience. This left women with nowhere to turn for practical advice on conception, contraception, as it existed, pregnancy, childbirth, and postnatal care, or even the basic mechanics of S3X relations. It was into this void that the figure of the midwife stepped, becoming the trusted confidant and the ultimate authority on all matters pertaining to female reproductive life. A midwife's expertise was not derived from books or university degrees, but from lifelong practical experience and an oral tradition passed down through generations. Often beginning as apprentices to older, experienced midwives, these women learned by observation and direct participation in countless births. They saw everything: easy deliveries, difficult labors, miscarriages, stillbirths, and the full spectrum of female physical and emotional responses to S3Xuality and reproduction. This intimate, hands-on knowledge made them truly indispensable. They understood the subtle signs of pregnancy, could recognize the stages of labor, knew techniques to ease pain, and were skilled in repositioning babies. Their wisdom extended beyond the birthing room. They were often the first and only resource for young brides seeking advice on marital consummation, for women struggling with conception, or for those desperate to prevent another pregnancy. The knowledge passed down by midwives encompassed a vast array of topics, far beyond just catching babies. It included practical advice on S3X intercourse itself. A young bride, often married off with little or no prior education about her own body or the physical act of marriage, would turn to the midwife or an older female relative who herself would have learned from a midwife for guidance. Midwives would offer discreet advice on positioning, what to expect, how to manage pain, and perhaps even how to navigate intimacy with a new husband. They were privy to the unspoken anxieties of women, the challenges of consummation, and the often unspoken difficulties within the marital bed. This information was crucial for women who lived in societies that simultaneously demanded fertility and chastity, often leaving them completely ignorant about the physical realities of their most important societal roles. Crucially, midwives also held the keys to much of the available fertility and rudimentary contraceptive knowledge. For women desperate to conceive, midwives knew about cycles, often recognized through observation of menstrual patterns rather than precise scientific understanding, beneficial herbs, and even specific practices believed to aid conception. They might recommend certain dietary changes, specific times for intercourse based on perceived fertility windows, or herbal concoctions. Conversely, for women who had already endured numerous difficult pregnancies and faced constant risk to their lives, midwives were often the quiet repositories of information on how to prevent conception. This knowledge, though often limited and relying on folk remedies rather than modern science, could include the use of certain herbs believed to induce menstruation or prevent conception, methods of withdrawal, or the timing of intercourse to avoid perceived fertile periods. These were often closely guarded secrets, shared discreetly from woman to woman, as official religious and legal doctrines typically condemned any form of birth control. This made the midwife's role not just practical, but often subversive, operating outside the official strictures of the church and state. The midwife's role extended deeply into the social and psychological fabric of women's lives. She was not just a medical practitioner. She was a confidant, a counselor, and a source of emotional support in a world where women's suffering was often minimized or ignored. Women could speak to their midwife about their deepest fears, their hopes for children, their marital difficulties, or their physical discomforts, knowing they would be met with understanding and discretion. In an era where female modesty was paramount, and discussing intimate matters with a male physician was unthinkable for many, the midwife provided a safe space for dialogue and care. This informal network of female-to-female knowledge transmission was essential for collective female well-being and survival, allowing women to navigate the perilous journey of reproduction with some degree of guidance and shared wisdom. The cultural significance of the midwife, however, was not without its challenges. As male-dominated medicine slowly began to professionalize and assert its authority, particularly from the 17th century onwards, midwives often found themselves marginalized, their traditional knowledge dismissed as superstition or old wives' tales. The rise of the male accoucheur, man midwife, and later the obstetrician, often backed by institutions and emerging scientific theories, though not always better outcomes initially, led to a gradual erosion of the midwife's social standing and authority. Furthermore, their powerful, independent position and their association with hidden female knowledge sometimes made them targets of suspicion, particularly during periods of intense religious fervor or witch hunts. Their remedies and practices, not understood by the male, medical establishment or the church, could be easily misconstrued as witchcraft or heresy, leading to persecution. Despite these historical challenges and the eventual decline of their preeminence in many Western medical systems, the historical role of midwives cannot be overstated. They were, in essence, the original women's health experts, operating at the grassroots level, providing crucial care and knowledge that no other formal system offered. Their quiet, informal passing down of information on S3X, fertility, and childbirth from woman to woman ensured the continuity of vital practical skills and emotional support for generations. They were a testament to the resilience of female community, ingenuity, and the power of experiential wisdom in a world that often sought to control and define women through male lenses. Even today, the resurgence of midwifery in many modern healthcare systems is a testament to the enduring value and profound humanity of the care and knowledge these historical guardians silently, yet powerfully, provided. For much of recorded history, beneath the rigid surface of societal norms and the formidable weight of religious doctrine, same S3X attraction undeniably existed. It was a human reality, present in every era and culture, yet its expression was overwhelmingly suppressed, condemned, and forced to remain hidden beneath layers of robes and rules. Unlike the overt celebrations, or at least more nuanced understandings found in certain ancient societies, the dominant Abrahamic traditions of the Western world, particularly after the rise of Christianity, established a moral framework that relentlessly demonized same S3X relationships. This created a profound and often terrifying imperative for individuals to conceal their true desires, forcing authentic affection into the deepest shadows of personal existence, under threat of severe social ostracism, legal persecution, and eternal damnation. The very concept of homosexuality as a fixed identity is a relatively modern construct, emerging largely in the 19th century. In earlier times, sexual acts were often categorized and condemned rather than individuals. However, this semantic distinction did not negate the existence of same S3X attraction and relationships. Indeed, historical records, though often fragmented and biased, reveal its persistent presence. From the passionate bonds described in classical Greek and Roman literature, though often understood differently than modern identity, to monastic friendships, Renaissance poetry, and courtly intrigues, evidence suggests that emotional and physical attraction between individuals of the same sex was a consistent, albeit often unacknowledged thread in the human tapestry. The challenge for historians is precisely that these expressions were forced into hiding, leaving only veiled illusions, coded language, and the tragic records of punishment. The primary force compelling this concealment was the overwhelming influence of religious doctrine, particularly within Christianity. Drawing upon interpretations of biblical texts, most notably passages in Leviticus and Romans, the Church systematically condemned same S3X sexual acts as unnatural and gravely sinful. This condemnation escalated over the centuries, solidifying into rigid theological positions that labeled such acts as sodomy, a term loaded with fear, disgust, and the spectre of divine wrath, sodomy was often considered one of the gravest sins, alongside heresy or bestiality, punishable by the most severe ecclesiastical and increasingly secular penalties. This religious condemnation wasn't merely a spiritual matter, it permeated every level of society, shaping laws, cultural attitudes, and individual consciences. For devout individuals experiencing same S3X attraction, the internal conflict between deeply felt desires and the profound fear of eternal damnation and societal disgrace must have been agonizing. This pervasive condemnation led to the development of sophisticated, often heartbreaking strategies of concealment. For many, the only option was to adopt a life of strict celibacy, denying their desires entirely and burying them under layers of religious piety or social conformity. Monasteries and convents, paradoxically, sometimes became havens for individuals who might have experienced same S3X attraction, offering a respectable and pure path that allowed them to live in single-sex communities, even if their inner lives remained a struggle. While outwardly conforming to vows of chastity, the intensity of emotional and intellectual bonds formed within these communities could sometimes blur the lines, leading to deeply intimate, though often unacknowledged or unconsummated, same-sex affections. Beyond formal institutions, individuals developed coded language and subtle gestures to communicate their attraction. This could manifest in highly stylized friendships, particularly between women, where passionate expressions of love and devotion were couched in terms of platonic affection. Letters between female friends, for instance, might contain effusive declarations that, to a modern eye, seem intensely romantic, yet were accepted within the social conventions of romantic friendship as purely innocent. For men, similar bromances or chaste friendships could provide a veil. However, these covers were always fragile, susceptible to misinterpretation or malicious accusation. The very physical environment of historical life often played a role in both facilitating and restricting such relationships. Single-sex environments, like boarding schools, military encampments, universities, domestic service, or all-female households, such as those of widows or unmarried sisters, inadvertently created spaces where intense emotional and physical bonds could form between individuals of the same sex. In these settings, away from the direct scrutiny of the opposite sex or conventional marital expectations, clandestine relationships might blossom. Yet, even here, these connections had to be shrouded in secrecy, existing only beneath the layers of robes and rules that defined formal conduct and moral expectation. The risk of exposure and the subsequent social ruin were ever present. The consequences of discovery were severe and varied, depending on the era and specific context. Legal systems, influenced by ecclesiastical law, increasingly criminalized sodomy. Punishments ranged from public shaming, fines, and imprisonment to the most brutal forms of execution, including burning at the stake, for sodomy was often linked to heresy, or hanging. Records from various European cities, particularly from the late medieval and early modern periods, contain harrowing accounts of individuals being prosecuted, tortured, and executed for same S3X acts. The moral panic around sodomy could also be used as a political weapon, with accusations levied against enemies to destroy their reputation and power. For women, while less frequently prosecuted legally for same-sex sexual acts, often because female desire was pathologized differently or simply overlooked by male legal systems, social ostracism, reputation ruin, and confinement, e.g., in convents or asylums, were very real threats. The fear of these repercussions acted as a powerful deterrent, forcing attraction into deep, suffocating concealment. Even in periods or places with slightly more tolerant attitudes, such as certain aspects of ancient Greek and Roman culture, it's crucial to understand that these expressions were often embedded within specific social structures, like mentorship, pederasty, or master-slave relationships, and were not equivalent to a modern understanding of consensual, equal, adult, same-sex relationships or identity. Furthermore, even in these contexts, explicit female-female intimacy was less discussed and often more hidden. The dominant historical narrative, shaped by Christian condemnation, ensured that any recognition of same-sex desire was framed as deviance. In conclusion, the undeniable existence of same S3X attraction throughout history, despite its forced concealment, is a testament to the enduring diversity of human desire. For centuries, individuals found themselves trapped between deeply felt personal longings and the crushing weight of religious prescription, societal stigma, and brutal legal penalties. Their lives were often defined by a profound paradox. Their desires were real, yet they had to live a performative existence, constantly hiding behind layers of expected gender roles, social conventions, and a rigid moral code. The robes and rules were not just garments or laws, they were metaphorical, shrouds, cloaking genuine affection in secrecy and fear. The fragments of evidence that remain, veiled poems, discreet letters, and the tragic records of prosecution, serve as powerful, if painful, reminders of the immense human cost of this suppression, and the resilience of love, even when forced, to whisper its name in the darkest corners of history. You've hit upon a fascinating and often contradictory aspect of historical governance. While moral and religious condemnations of prostitution were widespread, many towns and cities throughout history adopted a pragmatic approach, choosing to regulate and even profit from it. For centuries, across diverse cultures and continents, the relationship between society and prostitution has been remarkably complex and often deeply contradictory. While moral pronouncements and religious condemnations frequently cast the oldest profession into the shadows of sin and depravity, a striking historical reality emerges. Prostitutes were sometimes not only tolerated, but actively protected by the very towns and cities they inhabited, and in a remarkably pragmatic turn, their trade was often taxed like any normal business. This paradoxical approach, driven by a blend of economic necessity, social control, and a belief in prostitution as a necessary evil, offers a compelling glimpse into the fluid and often surprising ways societies have grappled with human sexuality and vice. The rationale behind such municipal involvement was multifaceted. Foremost among them was often the desire for social order and the containment of perceived disorder. Many medieval and early modern authorities, influenced by thinkers like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, held the view that prostitution, while sinful, served a vital purpose. It acted as a sewer, or a necessary evil, diverting male lust away from respectable women, and thereby protecting the purity of wives and daughters. By confining prostitution to designated areas, the infamous red light districts, or stews, authorities sought to control its spread and prevent it from spilling over into mainstream society. This pragmatic tolerance, however, was always underlain by a moral disapproval, a tension that would shape regulations for centuries. From this desire for containment sprang the impulse for regulation. Instead of futilely attempting to eradicate prostitution entirely, which history repeatedly showed to be impossible and often counterproductive, leading only to its proliferation in unregulated, dangerous forms, many towns opted to bring it under municipal control. This often involved the establishment of public or municipal brothels in cities like Toulouse, France, Hamburg, Germany, or Valencia, Spain, and even in parts of London, like Southwark. Under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, authorities would sometimes own or lease brothel properties. They would then license brothel keepers, setting specific rules for operation. These regulations could be incredibly detailed, dictating opening and closing hours, often forbidding operation on Sundays or religious holidays, setting prices for services, and even outlining the conduct expected of both the prostitutes and their clients. For instance, laws might prohibit married men or clergy from visiting certain establishments, or dictate that prostitutes wear distinctive clothing or headdresses to identify their profession, simultaneously offering them a form of public recognition and social marginalization. Beyond mere regulation, a significant driver for municipal engagement was revenue generation. Prostitution, being a consistent and often lucrative trade, presented an attractive source of income for town coffers. This taxation could take various forms. Brothel keepers might pay direct licensing fees, or a percentage of their earnings to the town council or ruling authority. Prostitutes themselves might be subject to specific taxes on their earnings, or the brothel might levy a fixed board and lodging fee that effectively served as a tax, with a portion going to the municipality. In some instances, fines levied for violating regulations, such as working outside designated areas or failing to adhere to conduct rules, also acted as an informal but consistent revenue stream. In Toulouse, for example, the profits from public brothels were famously shared between the city government and the local university, illustrating how deeply embedded and financially beneficial this regulated vice could be. This income contributed to public works, municipal services, or even the defense of the city, making the sinful trade a direct contributor to civic welfare. The protection offered by towns, though always conditional, was a crucial aspect of this system. For prostitutes, working in a regulated brothel or within a designated quarter offered a degree of safety and security that was often absent in unregulated street work. Municipal oversight could mean protection from arbitrary arrests, unchecked, violence from clients or pimps, and exploitation by unscrupulous landlords. Regulations might, for instance, limit a brothel owner's ability to financially exploit workers with predatory loans or exorbitant charges for basic necessities. In some cases, authorities might intervene to resolve disputes or ensure a modicum of fair treatment, recognizing that a stable and controlled prostitution industry benefited the town. This protection, however, was always transactional. It was granted in exchange for compliance with regulations and the generation of revenue, and it rarely extended to genuine social uplift or recognition of their human rights. Furthermore, these systems sometimes incorporated rudimentary public health measures. While far from modern healthcare, the devastating impact of sexually transmitted diseases, particularly syphilis, which swept through Europe from the late 15th century onwards, led some towns to mandate basic health checks for prostitutes. Women found to be infected might be quarantined or barred from working until they recovered. Though often coercive and lacking in genuine medical efficacy, given the limited understanding of disease at the time, these measures were an early attempt at public health intervention driven by the desire to protect the general populace, especially the male clientele, from contagion. This added another layer of regulation and, implicitly, a form of protection for the health of the community. However, it is vital to acknowledge that this protection and taxation came at a significant cost to the women involved. While offering some safety from street violence, working in municipal brothels often meant severe restrictions on personal freedom and autonomy. Prostitutes might be compelled to live within the brothel with limited mobility and little ability to leave the profession. Their earnings were often heavily siphoned off by keepers and taxes, leaving them with meager income. They were still considered members of a marginalized class, often subject to public scorn, social stigma, and denied the basic rights afforded to other citizens. The protection was for the industry and the town, not necessarily for the individual woman's well-being or dignity. The regulatory impulse, while pragmatic, simultaneously served to categorize and control, reinforcing their subordinate status within the social hierarchy. The era of sanctioned and taxed prostitution began to wane with significant shifts in social morality and public health understanding, particularly with the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, which brought renewed emphasis on stricter sexual morality. The dramatic upsurge of sexually transmitted diseases also fueled efforts to suppress brothels. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, waves of social reform movements, often driven by women's rights advocates and moral reformers, pushed for outright prohibition, seeing legalized prostitution as a moral blight and a form of exploitation rather than a necessary evil. This led to the closure of many public brothels across Europe and the United States, pushing the trade further underground. In conclusion, the historical phenomenon of towns protecting and taxing prostitutes like any normal business is a complex and revealing aspect of human history. It illustrates that societies, even those deeply committed to moralistic principles, often adopted pragmatic solutions to intractable social issues. Driven by a desire for order, revenue, and rudimentary public health, cities often institutionalized and regulated prostitution, creating a system that simultaneously offered a semblance of protection for the women involved, compared to completely unregulated markets, while also serving to control, exploit, and marginalize them. This historical legacy continues to inform debates about prostitution today, demonstrating the enduring tension between moral condemnation, social realities, and the timeless impulse of governance to regulate even the most controversial of human activities. Throughout human history, one of the most enduring and universal human desires has been to capture, secure, or ignite love. This profound yearning, combined with a limited understanding of science and a strong belief in magic and supernatural forces, gave rise to the widespread phenomenon of love potions. These concoctions were very much real in the sense that they were widely believed in, meticulously crafted, and eagerly consumed, designed to bewitch, entice, or bind a reluctant heart. While some of these elixirs were indeed derived from herbs with genuine psychoactive or aphrodisiac properties, many others were astonishingly, and often disturbingly, made from much stranger things, reflecting a blend of folk medicine, superstition, and a desperate, sometimes dangerous quest for romantic control. The concept of a love potion is as old as civilization itself, appearing in ancient Egyptian papyri, Greek myths, Roman literature, and across countless European, Asian, and African folk traditions. The underlying belief was that love, like illness or fortune, could be influenced, manipulated, or even conjured through external agents. This wasn't merely a romantic ideal. In societies where marriage was often a pragmatic alliance of families and fortunes, and personal affection might be secondary, a love potion could be seen as a tool to secure a desirable match, ensure fertility, or even rectify a faltering relationship. They offered a glimmer of hope to the lovelorn, the desperate, and the ambitious. The most common, and arguably most logical ingredients for love potions were herbs. Across cultures, indigenous botanical knowledge was vast, and certain plants were indeed recognized for their physiological effects on the human body. Herbs known to stimulate circulation, relax inhibitions, or produce mild hallucinogenic effects were frequently incorporated. For instance, mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, with its forked root eerily resembling a human figure, was steeped in myth and folklore. It was believed to have powerful magical properties, including inducing love and fertility, due to its genuine narcotic and deliriant alkaloids, though it was also highly toxic, making its use incredibly dangerous. Vervain, Verbena officinalis, associated with Venus, the Roman goddess of love, was widely believed to ignite passion and reconcile lovers, often worn as an amulet or brewed into a tea. Dittany of Crete, Origanum dictamnus, a fragrant herb mentioned by Virgil, was associated with childbirth and love, used in ancient Greece for its purported aphrodisiac qualities. From Central and South American traditions, Damiana, Turnera, diffusa, a shrub, was valued as an aphrodisiac to enhance sexual desire. Even common culinary spices like cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg, particularly those that produced warmth or stimulated the senses, were also believed to have aphrodisiac properties and were widely used in love potions, often simply added to food or drink. The appeal of these herbal remedies lay in their perceived connection to natural forces and their subtle, sometimes genuine, physiological effects. Even if purely psychosomatic, the belief in their power could be enough to alter perception and behavior. However, the realm of love potions quickly veered into the truly bizarre, often disturbing, and undeniably dangerous. When simple herbs failed to deliver the desired results, or when desperation overshadowed reason, the ingredients escalated into things that stretched the boundaries of credulity and morality. These strange additions often stemmed from sympathetic magic, the belief that like affects like. or from attempts to harness vital essences, regardless of how grotesque. Perhaps the most disturbing category involved elements from human remains and bodily fluids. Blood, particularly menstrual blood, was a highly potent and frequently cited ingredient. Given its visceral connection to fertility and the female reproductive cycle, it was believed to possess immense power to bind a lover, often secretly mixed into their food or drink. Similarly, urine, sweat, hair, nail clippings, or even skin scrapings from the desired person were thought to establish an intimate, inescapable connection to the potion's victim. Even more macabre were recipes calling for elements from the dead, such as powdered bones, graveyard dirt, or parts of cadavers, believed to harness residual life force or the chilling power of the underworld to compel love, a truly desperate and horrifying measure. Animal parts also featured prominently, especially from creatures believed to embody qualities like virility, passion, or faithfulness. Powdered bones or organs of virile animals, e.g. goat testicles, sparrow brains, due to their perceived promiscuity, or the blood of a sacrificed pigeon were common inclusions. The infamous Spanish fly, cantharidin, a potent and highly dangerous irritant derived from blister beetles, was widely used from the Roman era onwards, despite its severe toxicity. While it does irritate the genitourinary tract, causing a burning sensation that can be mistakenly interpreted as arousal, it frequently leads to severe pain, internal bleeding, kidney damage, and even death. Its use highlights the extreme risks people were willing to take. The concept of transference led to some truly disgusting ingredients, including excrement and filth. Feces, particularly human or animal dung, sometimes covertly mixed with food or drink, was believed to create an overpowering physical bond or induce a state of profound bewitchment. The more repulsive the ingredient, some practitioners believed, the more potent and inescapable its magical effect in bending the will of the victim. Beyond the truly vile, personal objects and symbolic items were also frequently incorporated. Items that had been in close physical contact with the desired person, such as pieces of their clothing, handkerchiefs, or even dust from their footprints, were often painstakingly ground up and added to potions or ritually burned as part of a spell to draw the person closer. Symbolic items like heart-shaped stones or effigies of lovers were also common, often prepared with elaborate incantations to imbue them with power. In addition to liquid potions, many love-inducing substances were created as love dusts or charms to be secretly sprinkled on a person, their clothes, or their doorstep. These dusts might contain a mysterious mix of powdered herbs, minerals, and the more bizarre ingredients mentioned, often combined with specific incantations or rituals performed under particular astrological signs to maximize their potency. The preparation of these potions was often as ritualistic as their ingredients were strange. They might need to be brewed under a specific moon phase, stirred with a particular type of wood, accompanied by specific chants, prayers, or esoteric incantations, or administered in a very precise manner, e.g., secretly mixed into a lover's wine or bread, applied while they slept, or placed under their pillow. The profound secrecy surrounding their creation and administration was absolutely paramount, as discovery could lead to grave accusations of witchcraft, sorcery, or poisoning, all of which carried severe legal and social consequences, including imprisonment, torture, or execution. The widespread belief in and use of these love potions reveals several profound insights into historical societies. Primarily, a lack of scientific understanding, where the lines between medicine, magic, and superstition were incredibly blurred, leading people to genuinely believe in the efficacy of these often dangerous concoctions. They also highlight the desperation for control over an unpredictable human emotion like love. Potions offered a perceived means of exerting influence over unpredictable human emotions and crucial social outcomes like marriage. Furthermore, they shed light on gender dynamics, as while both men and women sought love potions, they were often more strongly associated with women, either as makers or users, as a tool to gain agency in romantic matters. In societies where their choices and power were severely limited, a desperate woman, lacking social power or wealth, might turn to such magical means to secure her future or affection. Finally, the belief in love potions also fostered a profound fear of bewitchment or manipulation against one's will, contributing to accusations of witchcraft if relationships seemed to form unnaturally quickly, or if passions inexplicably changed, becoming a weapon in social disputes. In conclusion, love potions were indeed a very real, though often darkly fascinating and dangerous, feature of historical life. They represent a testament to humanity's enduring quest for connection and control over matters of the heart. From the relatively benign herbal remedies to the truly bizarre, repulsive, and highly toxic concoctions derived from human and animal parts, these elixirs underscore the desperate lengths to which people would go in pursuit of affection. They reflect a complex interplay of folk knowledge, magical belief, psychological desperation, and profound human desire, reminding us of a time when the boundaries between the natural, the supernatural, and the dangerously irrational were far less defined, and the pursuit of love could lead one down the strangest and most perilous paths imaginable. In the sprawling, often chaotic tapestry of historical rural life, the concept of privacy as we understand it today was virtually non-existent. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, serfs, and agricultural laborers who formed the bedrock of society, life was an almost constant public spectacle. Their homes, if they had distinct ones, were often little more than single-room hovels, shared with multiple family members, extended relatives, and even livestock. Walls were thin, doors were often open, and communal living was not a choice but a stark necessity for survival. Yet, despite this unrelenting lack of private space, historical evidence and logical deduction suggest that peasants might sneak into barns or fields at night. Privacy was something you had to invent. This quiet, often clandestine struggle for personal space reveals a profound human need for intimacy and solitude, pushing individuals to carve out moments of quiet dignity in a world designed to deny it. The structural realities of peasant life made privacy an unimaginable luxury. Most peasant dwellings were rudimentary, single-room structures known as cottage industries or longhouses. In these cramped spaces, entire families, often spanning multiple generations, lived, ate, slept, and worked together. There were no separate bedrooms, no individual studies, and certainly no locked doors. The hearth, the central point for cooking and warmth, dominated the single living area. Furthermore, it was common for livestock, chickens, pigs, goats, or even a cow, to share the living quarters, especially during harsh winters, for warmth and security. This meant constant noise, smells, and movement, making any semblance of personal space impossible during waking hours. The very design of these homes promoted communal interaction and discouraged individual retreat. Beyond the home, the village itself functioned as an extended, interconnected family where community oversight was pervasive. Lives were lived largely outdoors or in shared communal spaces. Work in the fields was a collective endeavor, often performed in close proximity. Socializing happened in public squares, at the well, or during communal feasts and religious gatherings. Gossip was a primary form of social control and information exchange, meaning that individual actions, relationships, and even subtle behaviors were constantly observed and commented upon by neighbors. There was little opportunity for solitude, for private conversation, or for intimate moments that were not potentially witnessed or quickly discovered by others. The concept of individual boundaries, so fundamental to modern privacy, was fundamentally alien to this communal existence. Given this constant lack of personal space, the human need for privacy didn't vanish. It simply adapted, forcing individuals to become remarkably resourceful and inventive. The cover of night became the most potent tool in this struggle. With the village asleep and the faint light of the moon or stars offering the only illumination, the fields, barns, and secluded corners of the land transformed into temporary, illicit havens. Sneaking into barns was a particularly common and practical solution. Barns, while part of the communal farm, offered layers of hay or straw that could provide both physical concealment and a degree of sound dampening. They were spaces of transient activity, less regularly monitored after chores were done, making them ideal for stolen moments of intimacy for courting couples or for individuals seeking a brief respite from constant familial scrutiny. The warmth of animals, while adding to the sense, could also provide a welcome comfort in cold nights. Similarly, the vastness of the fields outside the village provided another form of improvised privacy. Under the cloak of darkness, away from the watchful eyes of neighbors and family members, individuals could find isolated spots for quiet conversation, secret rendezvous, or simply a moment of solitary contemplation. The rustling of crops, the distant sounds of the countryside, and the darkness itself acted as a natural curtain, muffling voices and obscuring figures. These clandestine excursions were often driven by the yearning for romantic or sexual intimacy that could not be expressed within the crowded home. Young lovers, unable to find a moment alone under the vigilant eyes of their families, would risk the dangers of the night, wild animals, cold, or discovery, for precious, unobserved contact. But beyond romantic encounters, these outdoor escapes could also be sought by anyone craving a moment of solitude to think, to grieve, or simply to exist outside the constant demands of communal life. The invention of privacy wasn't just about physical spaces. It also manifested in psychological and social adaptations. People learned to develop inner sanctuaries, guarding their thoughts and feelings from public display. They became masters of discretion, using veiled language, subtle glances, or coded messages to communicate intimate matters without explicitly stating them. Humor and double entendre might be employed to discuss sensitive topics in front of others without revealing true intentions. The act of keeping secrets became a highly developed social skill, essential for maintaining personal dignity and agency in a world that offered little of either. This subtle art of concealment was a form of self-preservation, a way to maintain an inner life even when outer life was completely exposed. Moreover, the lack of privacy contributed to different societal norms around modesty and personal boundaries. What we consider deeply private today, bodily functions, childbirth, and sexual activity, were often more openly acknowledged or witnessed in historical peasant communities, simply due to the constraints of space. However, this didn't mean a lack of embarrassment or desire for discretion. Rather, it meant that rituals and social codes developed to navigate these public intimacies with as much grace or averted gaze as possible. The very act of seeking privacy in a barn or field was a testament to the persistent human need for these boundaries, even when society provided no formal means for them. In conclusion, the stark reality for medieval and early modern peasants was a life almost entirely devoid of conventional privacy. Their homes were crowded, their lives public, and their communities highly observant. Yet, this didn't extinguish the fundamental human need for solitude, intimacy, and personal space. Instead, it spurred a remarkable ingenuity. By sneaking into barns or fields at night, by mastering the art of discretion, and by carving out psychological sanctuaries, peasants effectively invented privacy in a world where it was structurally and socially denied. These clandestine acts highlight the enduring human desire for personal boundaries, demonstrating that even under the most constraining conditions, individuals will find ways to define and protect their private selves, transforming the darkness of the night and the anonymity of the land into the most precious of refuges. While the common peasant toiled in a world devoid of privacy, constantly inventing snatched moments of intimacy in fields and barns, their noble counterparts, seemingly, lived lives of unimaginable luxury and boundless freedom. Yet, behind the formidable stone walls of their opulent castles, amidst the tapestries and the servants, the reality for the aristocracy was often a paradox. Their luxury afforded them more opportunities, but also generated more scandals, making secret lovers a surprisingly common fixture behind castle walls. The very systems that granted them power and privilege, arranged marriages, dynastic ambitions, and relentless social scrutiny, simultaneously created a fertile ground for illicit passions, hidden affairs, and the tantalizing risk of exposure. The superficial impression of noble life was one of grandeur and strict propriety. Castles were fortresses of power, wealth, and lineage, meticulously designed to project authority and maintain social order. The nobility lived amidst fine silks, exquisite food, abundant servants, and extensive private chambers, a stark contrast to the communal existence of the lower classes. One might assume this privacy would facilitate their chosen relationships. However, the reality was far more nuanced and fraught with peril. Noble marriages were rarely, if ever, unions of romantic love. They were almost exclusively strategic alliances, meticulously negotiated contracts between powerful families designed to consolidate land, secure political influence, forge military alliances, or strengthen dynastic claims. A bride and groom might meet for the first time on their wedding day, their personal desires utterly secondary to the larger family agenda. Love, if it came at all, was expected to develop after the vows, and often became entangled with duties and obligations. This fundamental disconnect between the personal and the political in noble marriages created a fertile breeding ground for secret lovers. When affection, intellectual companionship, or passionate desire were absent from the marital bed, individuals naturally sought them elsewhere. The boredom of court life, the close proximity of numerous attractive and ambitious individuals, and the inherent human yearning for genuine connection all contributed to the pervasive culture of clandestine affairs. These weren't mere fleeting encounters. Many were deeply emotional, long-lasting relationships conducted under the constant threat of exposure. The luxury of the nobility, far from guaranteeing moral rectitude, actually provided the means and opportunities for illicit liaisons. Castles, though seemingly public with their large retinues, were labyrinthine complexes. They boasted numerous private chambers, hidden staircases, secret passages, secluded gardens, and remote wings that offered ample opportunities for discreet meetings. Servants, though ever present, could be bribed, intimidated, or simply loyal, becoming silent facilitators of clandestine romances. A lady-in-waiting might carry secret notes, a loyal valet might arrange a midnight rendezvous, or a chambermaid might turn a blind eye to a late-night visitor. The very opulence and sprawling nature of noble residences, intended for comfort and display, inadvertently became perfect settings for elaborate deceptions. Furthermore, the culture of courtly love, particularly prevalent in the High Middle Ages, while ostensibly platonic and idealized, inadvertently sanctioned the exploration of intense romantic feelings outside of marriage. Though often expressed through poetry, song, and chivalric gestures, this idealization of unattainable love could easily spill over into genuine physical passion. Knights might dedicate themselves to married ladies, and ladies might bestow favors upon their champions, blurring the lines between respectful admiration and forbidden desire. The elaborate rules and rituals of courtly love provided a convenient, albeit thin, veil for deeper, more dangerous attachments. However, the proliferation of secret lovers also meant a proliferation of scandals. While the nobility had more resources to hide their affairs, the stakes of discovery were exponentially higher than for a peasant. For women, the discovery of an illegitimate child or indiscreet affair could lead to public humiliation, repudiation by her husband, which meant financial ruin and loss of social standing, banishment to a convent, or even accusations of treason if the affair involved a political rival or threatened the legitimacy of heirs. For men, while generally facing less severe social consequences, an affair could still lead to duels, bitter feuds with rivals, political downfall, or direct challenges to their authority. Royal mistresses might wield significant power but always existed on a precarious edge, subject to the whims of the monarch and the jealousies of the court. The constant threat of scandal led to elaborate measures of secrecy and deception. Love letters were often written in code, or disguised as innocent correspondence. Meetings were arranged with meticulous planning, using alibis, intermediaries, and the cover of darkness or social events. The risk of eavesdropping by jealous spouses, watchful family members, or ambitious rivals meant that every word and gesture had to be carefully weighed. Poisonings, assassinations, and banishments were not uncommon consequences of affairs that went awry or threatened dynastic stability, turning the court into a dangerous arena of passion and betrayal. The very nature of court life also contributed to the high incidence of affairs. It was a world characterized by boredom, intense social pressure, and close proximity. Nobles, particularly women, often had little productive occupation beyond managing their households and engaging in social rituals. This idleness, combined with the forced intimacy of living in a restricted court environment, often bred discontent and the search for excitement. Furthermore, the practice of wet nursing and the upbringing of noble children by servants often meant a lack of emotional intimacy within the nuclear family, potentially pushing adults to seek deeper connections elsewhere. Historical accounts are replete with examples of these noble scandals. The courts of Henry VIII, Catherine the Great, Louis XIV, and numerous other monarchs and powerful lords were rife with intertwined lives, hidden passions, and brutal betrayals. Anne Boleyn's fate, for example, was ultimately sealed by accusations of incest and adultery, highlighting how easily sexual transgression could be intertwined with political conspiracy. The famous affair between Queen Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer in the 14th century, which led to the overthrow and murder of her husband Edward II, demonstrates the explosive power of illicit noble love when it intersected with political ambition. These stories, often chronicled by contemporary observers, reveal the pervasive nature of these secret relationships. In conclusion, the lives of nobles, seemingly defined by luxury and privilege, were often intensely fraught with emotional complexity and profound social risks. Their luxury provided the physical space and resources for secret lovers to exist, allowing for clandestine meetings within castle walls that were otherwise impossible for the common populace. Yet this very privilege also created a hotbed for scandals driven by the dictates of arranged marriages, the pressures of dynastic succession, and the ever-present human yearning for genuine connection. The story of noble love is thus a fascinating paradox. A tale of immense wealth and power intertwined with secret desires, intricate deceptions, and the ever-looming threat of ruin, all playing out behind the grand, yet ultimately porous, walls of the castle. Absolutely. This is a critically important and often uncomfortable truth about historical relationships, and it ties into many of the points we've already discussed. In the tapestry of human history, particularly before the modern era, the intricate dance of relationships bore little resemblance to contemporary ideals of mutual respect, explicit communication, and enthusiastic agreement. Instead, consent, as we understand it today, a freely given, informed, and ongoing agreement, was rarely discussed, acknowledged, or even conceptually understood within the frameworks of most relationships. Whether in marriage, servitude, or various social hierarchies, the foundational determinant of interaction was not personal agency, but power, which silently, yet absolutely, decided everything. This stark reality reveals a landscape of human connection, where authority, status, gender, and economic necessity dictated interactions, often rendering individual will and genuine desire utterly secondary or entirely irrelevant. The most pervasive arena where the absence of explicit consent was felt was within the institution of marriage. For the vast majority of historical societies, marriage was primarily a social, economic, and political contract, not a romantic partnership based on individual choice. Brides, particularly noble women, were often mere pawns in dynastic games, traded like commodities to secure alliances, consolidate land, or produce heirs. Their consent, if considered at all, was a mere formality, a nod or a ritualized gesture, often compelled by familial pressure, economic necessity, or direct command. A young woman might be betrothed in childhood with no say in her future husband, his age, or his character. To refuse could bring shame upon her family, jeopardize their financial stability, or even result in punishment like forced monasticism. This extended beyond the initial agreement. Once married, a woman was legally subsumed under her husband's authority. Her property, her body, and her labor became, in essence, his. Within the marital bed, the concept of a husband requiring his wife's explicit sexual consent for intercourse was largely absent from legal and theological discourse until much later periods. The conjugal debt, the expectation of sexual relations, was seen as a mutual obligation, but often interpreted as the husband's right, with the wife's refusal being a form of defiance or even a ground for legal complaint. Beyond marriage, the pervasive influence of power dynamics shaped virtually every social interaction. Feudalism, for instance, created rigid hierarchies where serfs owed labor and obedience to their lords, with little recourse. Their lives, marriages, and movements were often dictated by the land-owning nobility. In systems of slavery, consent was entirely annihilated. Individuals were considered property, their bodies and wills completely subjugated to their owners. This absolute power meant that any interaction, including sexual ones, was fundamentally non-consensual by definition, even if not explicitly violent. The master-servant relationship, prevalent in every noble household, and even many bourgeois ones, also operated on a clear power imbalance. Servants, often young and economically vulnerable, relied entirely on their masters for livelihood, shelter, and protection. This dependency created fertile ground for coercion. A master, or even an older servant, could exert immense pressure for sexual favors, with refusal potentially leading to dismissal, destitution, or severe social penalties. The power differential was so profound that even if an act was not overtly forced, the element of true, free consent was heavily compromised by the implicit threat of destitution or punishment. Even relationships between men and women in the broader community outside formal marriage were heavily influenced by these power structures. While casual encounters certainly occurred, a woman's reputation was often her most valuable asset. A liaison outside of marriage, especially if it resulted in pregnancy, could lead to public shaming, ostracism, and destitution. Men, facing fewer social repercussions for promiscuity, held the dominant social position, allowing them to pursue desires with less personal risk. The social environment itself was inherently coercive, subtly, or not so subtly, pushing individuals into roles and actions dictated by their gender, class, and family standing, rather than by personal desire. The very language and legal frameworks of historical periods underscore this absence of consent. Legal codes often focused on property rights, lineage, and the maintenance of social order, rather than individual bodily autonomy. Laws concerning sexual offenses typically centered on issues of property, e.g., seduction of a virgin often seen as damage to a father's property, legitimacy of heirs, or public scandal, rather than the victim's lack of consent in the modern sense. Rape, when legally recognized, was often framed more as a property crime against the male guardian or father, or a breach of public peace, rather than a violation of the woman's person. The concept of raptus, abduction, in medieval law, for example, often focused on the kidnapping itself, rather than the sexual violence within it, further muddying the waters of consent. Theological teachings, while condemning illicit sexual acts, often did so through the lens of sin against God or against the sacrament of marriage, rather than a clear understanding of personal violation without consent. The idea that a woman possessed a fundamental right to say no to sexual intimacy, even within marriage, was largely absent from dominant religious and legal discourse. This is not to say that women did not resist, or that all relationships were joyless and oppressive. Human ingenuity and affection always found ways to flourish, but these expressions often occurred despite the societal structures, not because of them. The evolution of consent as a recognized and fundamental concept is a relatively recent development, a product of centuries of social, legal, and feminist movements. It began to gain traction with Enlightenment ideas about individual rights, the rise of democratic thought, and, most significantly, with the advent of feminist movements in the 19th and 20th centuries that explicitly challenged patriarchal control over women's bodies and lives. It was only then that discussions around marital rape, sexual harassment, and the explicit articulation of consent began to enter mainstream discourse and legal frameworks. In conclusion, for the vast majority of historical relationships, consent was a rarely discussed or recognized concept. Instead, power, derived from social status, gender, economic standing, and legal frameworks, decided virtually everything. This reality shaped marriages as economic and political instruments, defined interactions between masters and servants, and dictated the very possibilities for personal expression. While human beings undoubtedly found moments of genuine connection and affection, these often existed within rigid structures that prioritized lineage, property, and social control over individual autonomy. The historical silence around consent serves as a powerful reminder of how profoundly different past relationships were from our contemporary ideals, highlighting the long and arduous journey towards recognizing and valuing individual agency and bodily autonomy in human connection. The image of the medieval monastery or convent is often one of serene piety, a sanctuary of unwavering devotion where monks and nuns lived lives of strict discipline, dedicated to prayer, study, and service. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed facade of spiritual perfection, the reality was often far more complex and human. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, while representing the ideal, were not always perfectly upheld. Some monks and nuns inevitably broke their vows, and the responses to these transgressions ranged from brutal punishment to, surprisingly, quiet forgiveness. This spectrum of reactions reveals the tension between the Church's unwavering moral pronouncements and the pragmatic realities of human fallibility, as well as the social and political factors that could influence the severity of judgment. The vows themselves were designed to create a radical separation from the worldly concerns of everyday life. Poverty meant renouncing personal possessions, embracing a life of communal sharing. Chastity demanded complete abstinence from sexual activity, a commitment to celibacy. Obedience required absolute submission to the authority of the abbot or abbess and to the rules of the monastic order. These vows were considered sacred pacts with God, and their violation was seen as a grave sin, a betrayal of divine trust. The theological weight of these promises meant that breaking them was not just a personal failing, but a potential threat to the entire monastic community and its spiritual integrity. The most common transgression, and arguably the most disruptive, was the breaking of the vow of chastity. The very nature of monastic life, with large groups of men or women living in close proximity, removed from the normal social constraints of family and marriage, could create an environment where human desires, however suppressed, might find expression. Historical records, though often couched in euphemisms, reveal that sexual activity did occur within monasteries and convents, both between members and with individuals outside the religious community. These liaisons, when discovered, posed a profound challenge to the authority and reputation of the Church. They undermined the ideal of monastic purity and could lead to scandal, undermining the very purpose of their existence. The punishments for breaking the vow of chastity were often severe, reflecting the gravity with which the Church viewed sexual sin. For monks, this could involve public shaming, flogging, imprisonment in a dark cell on a meager diet, or even expulsion from the order. For nuns, the consequences could be even harsher, including forced confinement, beatings, or, in extreme cases, being walled up alive. The fear of these punishments was a powerful deterrent, but it also drove transgressions underground, creating a culture of secrecy and potential hypocrisy. However, the response to broken vows was not always uniformly brutal. There were instances of quiet forgiveness, often influenced by pragmatic considerations, social status, or the circumstances surrounding the transgression. A powerful abbot or abbess might choose to quietly transfer a transgressing monk or nun to another monastery or convent, far from the scene of the sin, to avoid scandal or protect the reputation of the order. If the individual was from a noble family, their social standing might afford them a degree of leniency. The church, while upholding its moral stance, was also a political institution, sensitive to the influence of powerful patrons. Furthermore, the concept of penance offered a pathway back to grace. A monk or nun who confessed their sin, demonstrated sincere remorse, and performed prescribed acts of atonement, prayer, fasting, self-flagellation, might be forgiven and allowed to remain within the community. This system, while emphasizing the seriousness of the transgression, also acknowledged human fallibility and offered a path to redemption. The degree of penance, however, varied widely depending on the severity of the sin and the disposition of the abbot or confessor. The breaking of the vow of poverty was less scandalous, but still problematic. Monks and nuns were forbidden from owning personal property, yet the temptations of worldly goods could be strong. Some might secretly accumulate possessions, or use their position within the monastery to gain personal advantage. This was seen as a betrayal of the communal ideal and an erosion of the spiritual focus of the monastic life. Punishments for this could range from reprimands and the confiscation of the illicit goods to more severe penalties like temporary or permanent exclusion from communal activities. The vow of obedience, while seemingly straightforward, could also be a source of conflict. Monks and nuns were expected to follow the directives of their superiors without question, but human nature often chafed against this absolute authority. Disagreements, rebellions, or even open defiance could occur, particularly if the abbot or abbess was seen as unjust or tyrannical. The response to disobedience varied depending on the severity of the challenge and the personality of the leader. It could range from verbal rebukes to physical punishments, imprisonment, or even expulsion. The historical records of these transgressions are often fragmented and biased. Monastic chronicles tend to downplay or omit scandalous events to protect the reputation of the order. Legal documents and court records might offer glimpses into the secular consequences of monastic misbehavior, but they are often filtered through a lens of legal procedure rather than personal experience. The true extent of broken vows and the diverse responses to them remains a subject of ongoing historical investigation. In conclusion, the image of the perfectly pious monastery or convent is a romanticized ideal. The reality was that some monks and nuns, being human, inevitably broke their vows. While the church condemned these transgressions, the response varied widely, from brutal punishments to surprising instances of quiet forgiveness. This spectrum reflects the tension between unwavering moral pronouncements and the pragmatic realities of human fallibility, as well as the influence of social status, political considerations, and the complex interplay of power and mercy within religious communities. The stories of these broken vows, though often hidden beneath layers of silence and official pronouncements, offer a more nuanced and human glimpse into the lives of those who sought spiritual perfection, but often found themselves grappling with the very human realities of desire, ambition, and the enduring challenge of living up to impossible ideals. The solemn, often austere image of medieval and early modern religious life rarely conjures visions of anything other than piety and unwavering devotion. Holy books, meticulously hand-copied and illuminated, were revered objects, repositories of sacred scripture, and profound theological wisdom. They were considered instruments of salvation, carefully crafted to guide souls towards spiritual enlightenment and God. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed veneer of sanctity, a startling and undeniably human truth emerges from the historical record. Erotic drawings were sometimes hidden in the margins of these very holy books. Yes, seriously. This astonishing juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane, of profound spiritual aspiration coexisting with irreverent or explicit imagery, reveals a complex and often contradictory medieval psyche. It was a world where humor, satire, deep-seated human desires, and even a touch of rebellion could unexpectedly flourish, finding an unlikely canvas even within the most hallowed of texts. To fully grasp this fascinating phenomenon, one must first understand the intricate nature of medieval manuscripts. Before the revolutionary advent of the printing press, books were painstakingly created by skilled scribes. often working in monastic scriptoria or specialized professional workshops. This was an incredibly slow, laborious, and immensely expensive process, rendering books precious commodities. Every single page was a work of art, with text carefully copied in elegant script and often lavishly adorned with intricate initial letters, decorative borders, and detailed miniature illustrations. The margins, the seemingly blank spaces surrounding the main body of the text, were not merely empty areas. They were often seen as a secondary canvas, a versatile space for additional commentary, theological glosses, mnemonic aids, or indeed, various forms of artistic expression that ranged from the purely decorative to the wildly whimsical, and as we now definitively know, sometimes delightfully defiant or explicit. While many marginalia served serious academic or devotional purposes, a significant portion were purely imaginative, fantastical, or, in a striking number of cases, surprisingly risque. The types of holy books that contained these surprising and often cheeky illustrations were quite varied, underscoring the pervasiveness of the practice. They included crucial liturgical texts such as Bibles, psalters, books containing the Psalms for daily prayer, books of hours, highly popular personal prayer books used by lay people for their private devotions, missals, books containing the texts and rubrics for the Mass, and weighty theological treatises. The very sanctity and intended sacred purpose of these texts make the presence of erotic, vulgar, or overtly comical imagery within their borders all the more striking and, to a modern sensibility, profoundly shocking. It immediately begs the compelling questions: who dared to put them there? And what possibly motivated such an audacious act? Several plausible theories attempt to explain this bizarre juxtaposition, each offering a piece of the complex puzzle. One leading and widely accepted theory points directly to the scribes and illuminators themselves. These highly skilled artisans, whether monastic individuals or professional lay craftspeople, spent incredibly long hours, often cloistered away in silence, engaged in repetitive, meticulous work that could become profoundly tedious. As human beings with their own thoughts, desires, senses of humor, and perhaps even a degree of suppressed frustration, it is highly plausible that they used these available marginal spaces as a private, often subversive outlet. A momentary doodle of something irreverent, forbidden, or simply amusing could serve as a small personal rebellion. A quiet chuckle shared only with the parchment, and perhaps a trusted colleague. For monastic scribes, bound by strict vows of chastity and a life of rigorous self-denial, a secret erotic drawing might have been a clandestine way to acknowledge, cope with, or even subtly rebel against their vows in a private space that only they, and perhaps a select few, would ever come across. Another significant contributing factor was the distinctive medieval sense of humor and satire, which was often much cruder, more scatological, and more earthy than what modern sensibilities might expect. Even in a deeply religious society, many examples of marginalia from the period depict grotesque figures, bizarre hybrid creatures, animals behaving badly, often in human-like poses, engaging in sexual or violent acts, or scenes of overt folly and absurdity. The erotic drawings, therefore, might sometimes be understood as an integral part of this broader tradition of playful, subversive, or even satirical marginalia, rather than purely serious expressions of lust. They could function as witty caricatures of real people, subtle inside jokes shared among the scribes and their workshop peers, or a humorous, albeit blunt, commentary on the perceived hypocrisy, moral failings, or general follies of human nature, even within the most sacred of contexts. The private nature of many of these books also played a crucial role in their unconventional content. While some holy books were certainly intended for public use in churches or communal readings, many books of hours, for instance, were bespoke commissions ordered by wealthy lay individuals for their personal private devotion. These patrons might have possessed more eclectic or unconventional tastes, or perhaps the scribes felt a greater sense of anonymity or faced less severe scrutiny when working on such private commissions compared to official liturgical volumes. The hidden aspect of these drawings simply implies they were not central to the main text and were usually small, easily overlooked, unless one was specifically searching the margins, rather than being deeply concealed from absolutely everyone. Their placement suggests a nuanced understanding of who was likely to see them. The content of these surprising erotic drawings varied widely, but they generally depicted a range of human and sometimes anthropomorphic animal sexual activities and explicit imagery. This included straightforward representations of genitalia, often exaggerated or comically caricatured. There were figures engaged in various acts of intercourse, frequently simplified or stylized in their execution. Representations of masturbation were also found, sometimes imbued with elements of dark humor or crude commentary. Scenes of exhibitionism, with figures exposing themselves or striking suggestive poses, were not uncommon. Perhaps most bizarrely, many depicted fantastical or hybrid creatures, part human, part animal, engaged in overtly human sexual acts, blurring the lines between reality, myth, and satire, creating a truly unique visual language. In other instances, the erotic element was part of a larger, absurd, or comical scene, reflecting the medieval delight in the grotesque and the unexpected. These drawings, precisely because they were found within the sanctified pages of holy books, powerfully underscore a profound and enduring human tension. The simultaneous existence of spiritual aspiration and irreducible earthly desire. They serve as a vivid and sometimes shocking reminder that medieval people were not monolithic in their piety or their worldview. They were complex individuals grappling with their faith, their physical bodies, and the often mundane or challenging realities of daily life, often with a robust and earthy sense of humor that effortlessly transcended the boundaries of solemnity. The margins of these manuscripts effectively served as a liminal space, a zone of artistic freedom where the strict rules and moral codes governing the main text could be playfully, subversively, or even defiantly ignored. The historical discovery and scholarly study of these marginalia are relatively recent developments. For a long time, academics tended to focus solely on the main text and the grand official illuminations, largely overlooking or outright dismissing the minor, degenerate, or unseemly marginalia. It has taken a significant shift in academic perspective, particularly within art history and medieval studies, to recognize the immense cultural, social, and psychological value of these seemingly irreverent doodles. They now provide an invaluable and uniquely intimate window into the daily lives, prevalent humor, and often unspoken thoughts of the people who created and meticulously used these books, revealing a medieval world that was far less austere and far more colorful, rebellious, and indeed unexpectedly erotic than often imagined. They fundamentally challenge our modern assumptions about the past, forcing us to confront the vibrant and sometimes shocking contradictions that were an intrinsic part and parcel of historical human experience. In conclusion, the fascinating presence of erotic drawings hidden in the margins of holy books is not merely a historical anomaly, but a profound testament to the multifaceted nature of the human spirit. Far from being simple acts of disrespect or desecration, these seemingly incongruous illustrations were products of human scribes and artists seeking outlets for boredom, personal expression, unique humor, or perhaps grappling with suppressed desires. More broadly, they reflect a pervasive medieval sensibility that found both amusement and meaning in the juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane. They offer a vivid and sometimes shocking reminder that even in the most revered and spiritually charged of contexts, human creativity, irreverence, and the persistent, undeniable reality of desire could find subtle, yet powerful, ways to etch themselves into history, providing us with an unexpectedly intimate and candid glimpse into the minds and lives of those who lived centuries ago. Throughout various periods of history, amidst widespread ignorance of modern medicine and the pervasive influence of spiritual beliefs, the act of S3X transcended mere procreation or pleasure to encompass profound, often mystical powers. For many, it was genuinely believed that S3X could heal you, or even drive out evil spirits. This deeply held conviction, seemingly counterintuitive to modern understanding, stemmed from a complex interplay of ancient medical theories, religious dogma, folk traditions, and a fundamental misunderstanding of both the human body and the nature of illness. It paints a vivid picture of a world where the physical and the spiritual were inextricably linked, and where the most intimate act could be seen as a potent force against both bodily infirmity and malevolent supernatural entities. The belief that S3X possessed therapeutic qualities was rooted in several ancient medical theories, most notably the humoral theory prevalent from antiquity through the early modern period. This theory posited that the human body was composed of 4 cardinal humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, and that illness resulted from an imbalance of these humors. Sexual activity, particularly ejaculation, for men, and orgasm, for women, was seen as a way to expel excess humors or to achieve a necessary bodily release or purging. For men, semen was often considered a vital excess fluid, and its regular expulsion through intercourse or nocturnal emissions was believed necessary for health, preventing a buildup that could lead to various ailments like headaches, melancholy, or even madness. Women's bodily humors were believed to be naturally more moist and cold, and orgasm was sometimes seen as essential for expelling corrupt humors or facilitating a necessary flush that maintained balance and prevented uterine disorders or hysteria. Thus, for both sexes, sexual activity was integrated into a holistic, if flawed, understanding of bodily equilibrium. Beyond humoral theory, specific ailments were sometimes thought to be curable by sexual acts. For instance, hysteria, a broad diagnosis often applied to various female complaints, from anxiety to physical symptoms, was, for centuries, believed to be caused by a wandering womb or a lack of sexual activity and orgasm. In some medical texts and popular beliefs, regular intercourse or even stimulation to orgasm, sometimes performed by physicians or midwives, leading to the early use of vibrators for MYM. Hysterical paroxysm was prescribed as a cure. Similarly, conditions like melancholy or certain forms of madness were occasionally linked to sexual abstinence, with intercourse believed to alleviate the mental distress by providing a necessary physical and emotional release. The emphasis on purging and release was a consistent theme across various supposed cures. Perhaps even more strikingly, some beliefs centered on S3X as a potent weapon against evil spirits, demonic possession, or malevolent magic. This idea was particularly prevalent in cultures where disease and misfortune were often attributed to supernatural causes rather than biological ones. If a person was afflicted by a persistent illness, inexplicable pain, or strange behaviors, it might be interpreted as an invasion by a demon or the result of a malicious spell. In such cases, desperate measures were sought to drive out the unseen entities. Sexual acts, especially those involving intense physical and emotional energy, were sometimes believed to be capable of disrupting spiritual attachments. This could manifest in various, often disturbing ways. Exorcism through intercourse. In some extreme and deeply troubling instances, particularly during witch hunts or periods of intense demonological fear, intercourse might be prescribed, or even forced upon an afflicted individual as a means of exorcism. The rationale was that the purity of the act, or the physical exertion, would make the body an inhospitable vessel for the evil spirit, or that the demon would be expelled through the very act of copulation. This was often a highly coercive and abusive practice, masquerading as therapy. Breaking curses. If a person believed they were under a love curse, or a spell that prevented them from finding love or conceiving, certain sexual acts, sometimes involving specific rituals or partners, were believed to break the enchantment. The intimate connection was seen as a way to counteract or sever the magical ties binding the victim. Amulets and fetishes, elements derived from sexual acts, such as menstrual blood or seminal fluid, often mixed into potions or charms, were also believed to possess apotropaic, evil-averting properties, or to draw out illness. These were not direct sexual acts, but rather products derived from them, used in sympathetic magic. Symbolic reversal. Some folk beliefs held that if a person was bewitched to be impotent or barren, engaging in sexual acts with a fertile or uncursed partner, or even engaging in acts considered taboo, like with a prostitute or someone considered unclean, could symbolically reverse the curse and restore their natural functions. The role of folk healers and cunning folk in rural communities often perpetuated these beliefs. Lacking formal medical training, they relied on a mix of herbal remedies, spiritual practices, and traditional wisdom, which often included sexual prescriptions. These practitioners might advise clients on specific sexual acts, partners, or timings to achieve desired healing or to ward off evil. Their authority was based on their perceived connection to ancient knowledge and their ability to address both the physical and spiritual dimensions of suffering, which conventional doctors or priests might overlook. However, it is crucial to note that these beliefs existed alongside, and sometimes in tension with, official religious and medical condemnations. The Church, while acknowledging the existence of demons, vehemently condemned many sexual practices, particularly those outside of marriage, and would certainly not endorse sexual acts as a form of exorcism. These beliefs were often part of a vast, unwritten tradition of folk magic and informal medicine, existing at the margins of official doctrine, but deeply ingrained in popular consciousness. They highlight the desperate measures people would resort to in a world without effective medical treatments for many ailments, turning to any perceived avenue for relief, even if it involved intimate or morally fraught actions. In conclusion, the historical belief that S3X could heal you, or even drive out evil spirits, is a striking testament to the complex and often paradoxical ways humans have understood the body, disease, and the supernatural. Rooted in ancient humoral theories and pervasive spiritual explanations for illness, intercourse and sexual acts were seen as potent tools for purging imbalances, curing specific ailments like hysteria, and even combating demonic influence or curses. While often existing within the unofficial realms of folk medicine and popular belief, sometimes leading to coercive and abusive practices, this conviction profoundly shaped the understanding of human sexuality beyond simple reproduction. It underscores a fundamental truth about humanity's past, that in a world grappling with illness and the unknown, people would imbue even the most intimate acts with immense power, turning to them as a desperate and sometimes dangerous means of survival, healing, and spiritual protection. Intercourse between a married person and someone other than their spouse was considered far more than a personal betrayal. It was a profound transgression against religious law, social order, and property rights, carrying consequences that varied drastically depending on one's social status and, more often than not, their gender. While its discovery could universally lead to public shame, the actual repercussions could range from relatively minor ecclesiastical penance to brutal violence, disfigurement, economic ruin, or even death, with the severity of punishment frequently dictated by the complex interplay of power, legitimacy, and honor within a given society. The very definition and culpability of adultery often carried a deeply ingrained double standard. In many historical legal and social systems, adultery was primarily viewed as a transgression committed by a married woman or by a man who had sex with another man's wife. This perspective stemmed largely from patriarchal concerns about legitimacy of heirs and the purity of bloodlines. If a married woman had a child with a man other than her husband, it could introduce an illegitimate heir into the family lineage, jeopardizing inheritance, property rights, and the very foundation of the patriarchal family structure. Consequently, a woman's adultery was often seen as more a crime of property than of sex, a violation of her husband's or father's property rights over her body and reproductive capacity. While religious laws, particularly within Christianity, condemned extramarital sex for both men and women as a sin, the secular legal and social penalties almost invariably weighed more heavily on women. A husband's extramarital affairs, while perhaps morally frowned upon, rarely carried the same severe legal or social penalties, especially if his partner was unmarried, a prostitute, or of a lower social class. For commoners, particularly women, the consequences of adultery could be devastating. Public humiliation was a common punishment, designed to destroy one's fama, reputation or good name, and serve as a stark warning to others. In some Germanic traditions, a husband who caught his wife in adultery might publicly shave her head, strip her in the presence of her kinsmen, thrust her from his house, and even flog her through the village, ensuring her lifelong shame and making it difficult for her to ever find another spouse. Other forms of public shaming included being placed in stocks or a pillory, or being forced to wear distinctive clothing or symbols. In some medieval French towns, adulterous couples were even subjected to the run, la course, where they were roped together, sometimes naked or in their undergarments, and forced to run a gauntlet through the streets, often preceded by trumpeters, to draw a crowd, enduring public taunts and sometimes beatings. For a woman, the loss of her dowry and expulsion from her home were frequent economic penalties, leaving her destitute and socially outcast. While less common, in some early medieval legal codes, the husband was even granted the right to kill his adulterous wife and her lover if caught in the act. For the nobility, the stakes of adultery were infinitely higher, intertwined with political power, dynastic stability, and international relations. While noble castles offered more physical privacy for illicit liaisons, as discussed previously, the consequences of discovery were potentially catastrophic, far exceeding mere public shame. For a noblewoman, discovery could lead to immediate repudiation by her husband, a political and economic disaster for her birth family. She might be imprisoned, forcibly confined to a convent for life, or even executed, particularly if her affair threatened the legitimacy of a royal line, or involved a powerful political rival. The infamous Tour de Nesle affair in 14th century France, involving the queens and princesses of the Capetian dynasty, saw female members imprisoned and their alleged male lovers tortured, castrated, and executed in horrific ways, demonstrating the brutal penalties when royal honor and succession were at stake. The very stability of kingdoms could hinge on the perceived purity of a royal marriage. Noble men, while generally enjoying greater latitude, were not entirely immune to severe repercussions, especially if their affair was with another powerful noble's wife, leading to violent feuds, duels, or assassinations. A husband might take extreme measures to avenge his honor, and the legal system often gave him significant leeway in doing so, sometimes even overlooking violence or murder committed against the wife or her lover. The crime of passion defense, where a husband's violent reaction to a discovered affair was deemed understandable or even excusable, has a long and dark history in many legal systems. Beyond immediate personal consequences, adultery also had significant legal and ecclesiastical ramifications. Ecclesiastical courts frequently handled cases of adultery, imposing spiritual penances such as public confession, fasting, and prayer. While the Church generally advocated for reconciliation and viewed marriage as indissoluble, it could grant divorces in cases of adultery, though this often meant the innocent party was free to remarry, while the guilty party was not. Secular laws, drawing from Roman and Germanic traditions, varied widely, but often included fines, corporal punishment, such as flogging or mutilation like cutting off ears or noses, and banishment. In some jurisdictions, particularly in the Roman Empire after Augustus, adulterers could face exile and confiscation of property. Later, under Christian emperors like Constantine, the death penalty for adultery was even reintroduced, with husbands sometimes regaining the right to kill their adulterous wives. The legal and social enforcement of adultery laws often fluctuated, based on time, location, and the prevailing moral climate. Periods of religious revival or social reform often saw intensified efforts to crack down on perceived sexual immorality, leading to harsher punishments. Conversely, in some subcultures, or during certain periods, a degree of tacit acceptance or turning a blind eye to affairs, particularly male ones, might have been common. The hypocrisy inherent in the double standard meant that while women faced severe and often life-altering consequences, men, especially those in positions of power, frequently escaped with little more than a bruised reputation, if that. In conclusion, the historical ramifications of adultery were profound and far-reaching, extending far beyond personal heartbreak to encompass religious damnation, social disgrace, economic ruin, and physical violence. The axiom that adultery could lead to public shame, or worse depending on your status, perfectly encapsulates this harsh reality. While public humiliation was a shared experience across social strata, the ultimate fate of the transgressor was inextricably linked to their position in the social hierarchy. For commoners, it meant indelible public disgrace and destitution. For nobles, it could mean political downfall, imprisonment, or even death, particularly for women whose bodies and reproductive capacities were seen as crucial instruments of dynastic power. This historical landscape reveals a world where the personal morality of individuals was constantly scrutinized through the unforgiving lens of social order, property, and power, with a harsh, often gender-biased, justice meted out to those who dared to defy the strict marital bonds of their era. Throughout history, life for the common person was largely defined by arduous labor, strict social hierarchies, and the ever-present demands of religious observance. Yet periodically, the monotony was broken by festivals, vibrant, often chaotic communal celebrations that offered a vital escape from daily drudgery. These were occasions of revelry, characterized by abundant wine, exuberant dancing, and a palpable loosening of inhibitions that frequently led to unexpected nighttime pairings. Far from being mere innocent merriment, these festivals served as crucial safety valves for societies otherwise tightly constrained by moral codes, providing unique opportunities for clandestine romance, sexual encounters, and the temporary suspension of rigid social rules, all under the convenient guise of celebratory abandon. The very essence of a historical festival was its contrast to everyday life. While routine existence was marked by scarcity and sobriety, festivals often involved a deliberate collective indulgence in excess. Alcohol, particularly wine, ale, or cider, flowed freely, often homebrewed and consumed in quantities that would be considered extreme today. This heavy consumption was not merely for enjoyment, it served as a powerful disinhibitor. The dulling of senses and the blurring of moral lines induced by alcohol consumption significantly lowered social guardrails, making individuals bolder, less concerned with reputation, and more open to spontaneous interactions they might otherwise shun. This communal intoxication created an atmosphere where ordinary strictures on behavior could be temporarily set aside, allowing desires to surface that were normally suppressed. Complementing the flow of alcohol was the pervasive element of dancing. Unlike the structured, often formal dances of the nobility, peasant dances were typically energetic, communal, and often highly physical. Circle dances, line dances, and jigs involved close contact, sweating bodies, and rhythmic movements that could be deeply sensual. The very act of dancing, especially when prolonged and combined with alcohol, generated a heightened state of excitement and physical awareness. It fostered a sense of collective euphoria and anonymity within the crowd, making it easier for individuals to touch, flirt, and engage in more intimate gestures without immediate detection or condemnation. The physicality of the dance broke down personal barriers and dissolved the usual distance maintained between unmarried men and women, or even between those from different social strata for the duration of the festivities. The social dynamics of festivals were profoundly different from daily life. For much of the year, young unmarried men and women, often living in multi-generational homes, had very limited opportunities for unchaperoned interaction. Their courtship was usually overseen by family and community, focused on practical considerations rather than personal attraction. Festivals, however, shattered these constraints. They gathered large numbers of people from various villages, creating a temporary melting pot where anonymity was possible. The sheer chaos and crowded nature of the celebrations made strict chaperoning impractical, if not impossible. This created a fertile ground for unexpected nighttime pairings, where individuals who might never otherwise have the chance to interact intimately could find themselves drawn together by the festive atmosphere, the alcohol, and the collective sense of liberation. These pairings were often fleeting and opportunistic. Under the cloak of darkness, amidst the waning fires of the bonfire or the shadows between stools, young couples might sneak away for a stolen kiss, a private conversation, or even a sexual encounter. For those burdened by rigid social expectations or forbidden attractions, festivals offered a rare window of freedom. A servant might find herself drawn to a laborer from a neighboring village, or a married person might succumb to temptation, knowing that the dense crowd and the spirit of revelry provided a temporary shield against prying eyes and the harsh judgment of the community. The anonymity of the night, coupled with the communal indulgence, provided a fleeting sense of impunity. The societal function of these nighttime pairings also deserves consideration. In societies with strict premarital sexual norms and often arranged marriages, festivals acted as an implicit, if unacknowledged, release valve for sexual tension. By allowing for a controlled period of moral relaxation, they might have paradoxically helped to maintain the stability of the everyday social order. The occasional, discreet transgression during a festival might have been tolerated as a necessary human outlet, as long as it didn't lead to outright scandal or disrupt the fundamental structures of marriage and family. However, this tolerance was always conditional. While the acts themselves might be overlooked in the immediate revelry, the consequences, such as an unexpected pregnancy or a public discovery, could still lead to severe repercussions, particularly for women once the festival lights faded and normal life resumed. Furthermore, some festivals had roots in ancient pagan traditions that celebrated fertility, the changing seasons, and life itself. These deeper, pre-Christian layers often retained a sensual or even explicitly sexual undertone, which contributed to the loosening of inhibitions. Festivals like May Day in Europe, harvest festivals across various cultures, or ancient Roman Bacchanalia were originally designed to celebrate fecundity, and their associated rituals often involved behaviors that were overtly sensual or ritualistically promiscuous. Even after Christianization, some of these underlying themes persisted, subtly influencing the atmosphere and encouraging a temporary suspension of Christian moral codes during the celebration. The line between sacred celebration and profane revelry was often blurred. In conclusion, historical festivals were far more than simple holidays. They were transformative events that temporarily inverted the strict social order of everyday life. Fueled by copious amounts of wine and energetic dancing, these celebrations fostered an environment of heightened emotion and relaxed inhibitions, which frequently led to unexpected nighttime pairings. This phenomenon highlights the enduring human need for intimacy, escape, and pleasure, even in the face of rigid social constraints. While these fleeting moments of freedom offered a vital outlet for desires otherwise suppressed, they also underscore the inherent tensions within historical societies, between rigid moral codes and human nature, and between communal order and individual longing, demonstrating how even in a world of strict rules, the spirit of revelry could carve out clandestine spaces for connection, albeit often with a silent understanding of the risks involved. Once the dawn broke and the party ended. In countless historical societies, the rhythms of daily life, from the most mundane tasks to the most intimate interactions, were profoundly dictated by deeply ingrained beliefs about clean and unclean days. This wasn't merely about physical hygiene in the modern sense. It was a complex system of ritual purity and pollution, often rooted in religious doctrine, folk superstition, and a fundamental misunderstanding of health and disease. Consequently, clean versus unclean days decided everything, from when one could wash to when one could even touch certain objects or individuals, imposing a pervasive framework that governed communal life, personal conduct, and spiritual status. This system, while appearing illogical to contemporary minds, provided a powerful means of social control, spiritual connection, and an early, albeit flawed, attempt at managing perceived threats to well-being. The concept of ritual impurity was a cornerstone of many ancient religions, notably Judaism, Hinduism, and various indigenous spiritual traditions. In these frameworks, certain physical states, bodily functions, or contact with specific objects were believed to render an individual ritually unclean or impure, temporarily separating them from the sacred, the divine, or the community. This impurity was not necessarily a moral failing, but a ritual state that required specific purification rites to be restored to a state of cleanliness or purity. The most common source of female uncleanliness was menstruation. Across numerous cultures, menstruating women were considered ritually impure and subject to various restrictions. For instance, in ancient Israelite law, Leviticus 15, a menstruating woman was deemed niddah and considered ritually unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touched her, her bed, or anything she sat on would also become unclean. This often meant temporary segregation, where women might be confined to specific huts or areas, forbidden from cooking, touching food, participating in religious rituals, or engaging in sexual intercourse. These taboos, while appearing oppressive, were sometimes interpreted by women as periods of rest or special status, though the underlying reason was often based on fear and misunderstanding of natural bodily processes. The belief was not necessarily that menstrual blood itself was evil, but that it was a powerful, even dangerous, substance that could convey ritual impurity. Beyond menstruation, other bodily fluids and states were frequently associated with uncleanliness. Childbirth, for example, rendered a woman, and sometimes those who assisted her, ritually impure for a prescribed period, often requiring a ritual purification bath or offering before she could re-enter the community or a sacred space. This period of lying in was often observed, even if the ritualistic purification aspect faded, retaining a social custom. Seminal emissions, particularly those occurring outside of a procreative context, like nocturnal emissions, could also render a man ritually impure for a day, requiring washing before engaging in religious activities or interacting with others. Contact with the dead, corpses, was almost universally considered a source of profound ritual impurity in many cultures, demanding extensive purification rituals and periods of isolation. Certain diseases, particularly skin conditions like leprosy, though often a broader term for various dermatological ailments, were also viewed through the lens of ritual impurity, leading to the strict isolation of affected individuals for fear of contagion, often conflating spiritual defilement with physical illness. These beliefs profoundly influenced daily practices, including hygiene and social interaction. On unclean days, individuals might be forbidden from participating in public rituals, from preparing food, or even from direct physical contact with clean individuals. This dictated when to wash, not necessarily for physical cleanliness alone, but for ritual purification. Specific washing rituals, sometimes involving immersion in natural water, like a mikvah in Judaism, or the use of particular substances, were prescribed to cleanse away ritual impurity. The act of washing was often less about removing dirt and more about restoring a state of ritual acceptability. Conversely, the idea that excessive washing on clean days could somehow open the body to illness by opening pores, for example, also existed, reflecting a cautious and often contradictory approach to hygiene. The impact on social touching was immense. The fear of transmitting ritual impurity meant that physical contact with unclean individuals or objects was strictly avoided. This could lead to social ostracism, as people tried to distance themselves from those deemed impure, even if temporarily. For example, a menstruating woman might not be allowed to sit on the same furniture, use the same utensils, or share the same bed as her husband. While the rich might have separate quarters for such periods, the poor, living in single-room dwellings, would have to devise makeshift barriers or adhere to strict non-contact rules within the same space, leading to immense psychological and social strain. These rules created a rigid social grammar, dictating who could touch whom, when, and under what circumstances, reinforcing hierarchies and boundaries within the community. The motivations behind these clean versus unclean distinctions were complex. They provided a framework for social organization and control, delineating insiders from outsiders, and reinforcing communal identity through shared rituals of purity. They also offered a rudimentary, albeit often misguided form of public health or contagion control, especially concerning diseases or contact with the dead. While the scientific basis was absent, the practice of isolating the sick or those who had handled corpses could inadvertently limit the spread of disease. Furthermore, these rituals provided a sense of spiritual order in a chaotic world, allowing individuals to feel connected to the divine by adhering to sacred laws, even if they didn't fully comprehend the underlying reasons. The very act of adherence became a demonstration of piety and faith. In conclusion, for much of history, clean versus unclean days decided everything, from when to wash to when to touch, fundamentally shaping daily life and social interactions. These systems of ritual purity, deeply embedded in religious doctrine and popular belief, governed personal hygiene, social contact, and spiritual status, particularly for women during menstruation or childbirth, and for anyone who had come into contact with the dead or specific ailments. This pervasive framework, while often appearing restrictive and illogical from a modern perspective, served crucial functions in historical societies. It provided a means of social control, reinforced communal identity, and offered a spiritual pathway for navigating a world filled with disease and mystery. The legacy of these ancient purity laws, though transformed, can still be observed in certain cultural practices and implicit social biases today, underscoring their enduring impact on human understanding of the body, cleanliness, and the sacred. You've articulated a beautiful and profound final point that truly brings it all together, cutting through the historical differences to reveal a universal human core. It serves as an excellent concluding thought, drawing on all the preceding discussions about their challenging lives, hidden desires, and constant search for connection. After delving into the intricate, often perplexing, and sometimes brutal realities of medieval life, a world of arranged marriages, suppressed desires, strict moral codes, and constant public scrutiny, it's tempting to view the people of that era as fundamentally alien, products of a bygone age utterly unlike our own. We see their strange customs, their unwavering faith, their harsh punishments, and their limited understanding of science, and a vast gulf appears to open between them and us. Yet beneath the layers of historical difference, the ultimate truth about medieval men and women, and indeed people from any historical period, is remarkably simple and deeply resonant. In the end, medieval people were just like us, confused, curious, and quietly longing for closeness. Their lives were undeniably shaped by vastly different circumstances, but their fundamental human needs, their inner struggles, and their universal desires for connection and understanding remained remarkably consistent, echoing across the centuries. To our own contemporary experience, consider the pervasive confusion that must have marked their daily existence. Medieval people lived in a world where the causes of illness were mysterious, attributed to imbalances of humors, divine displeasure, or demonic influence rather than germs. The very act of sleeping could lead to a wet dream, generating profound shame and guilt, with no scientific explanation to alleviate their distress. Agricultural failures, violent outbreaks, or sudden deaths could strike without warning, leaving them grappling with inexplicable misfortune. Their understanding of the cosmos was geocentric, their sense of time cyclical, and their daily lives dictated by the strictures of a powerful church and an often arbitrary feudal system. They were born into predefined roles, with little social mobility, their futures largely predetermined. This constant uncertainty and lack of control over their environment and destiny must have fostered a deep, abiding confusion about why things happened as they did, and what their individual purpose truly was in the grand scheme of a world governed by both divine will and unpredictable chaos. This echoes our own modern confusion in the face of complex global challenges, personal crises, and the vast, often overwhelming amount of information we must process daily. Despite this confusion, or perhaps because of it, medieval people were undeniably curious. This wasn't necessarily the systematic, scientific curiosity of the Enlightenment, but a fundamental human drive. To understand their world, to seek meaning, and to explore the boundaries of their knowledge. Their curiosity manifested in their elaborate theological debates, their fascination with the natural world, even if filtered through symbolic interpretations, their invention of intricate technologies like the Gothic arch or the mechanical clock, and their thirst for stories and narratives that made sense of their experiences. The hidden erotic drawings in the margins of their holy books, for example, aren't just expressions of suppressed desire, but also acts of playful, subversive curiosity, an exploration of boundaries, a testing of limits within a sacred space. Their very religious practices, from pilgrimages to intricate rituals, were driven by a profound curiosity about the divine, about the afterlife, and about their place within a vast, spiritually charged universe. Just as we are endlessly curious about technology, space, or the intricacies of human psychology, they too sought to unravel the mysteries of their known world, driven by an innate human impulse to learn and comprehend. And perhaps most profoundly, medieval people like us harbored a deep and often quiet longing for closeness. In a world that often suppressed individual affection, dictated marriages for strategic gain, and criminalized same-sex attraction, the human heart nonetheless yearned for genuine connection. We've seen how this longing drove peasants to sneak into barns or fields at night, inventing moments of privacy for intimacy that their crowded homes denied them. We've explored how nobles, despite their luxury, navigated a landscape of arranged marriages by seeking secret lovers behind castle walls, risking ruin for moments of true emotional or physical connection. We've touched on how monks and nuns, despite their vows of chastity, sometimes found themselves breaking those vows, driven by the powerful, universal desire for human contact and affection, sometimes even finding quiet forgiveness for their transgression. Even the desperate search for love potions speaks volumes about this longing, a desire so intense that people would resort to magical, often dangerous means to compel affection that eluded them naturally. This fundamental human need for connection, for belonging, for shared experience, and for intimate understanding is a timeless thread that weaves through all human history. They sought love, friendship, familial bonds, and community, just as we do, often with profound vulnerability and quiet desperation, in a world that often made such closeness difficult or dangerous. The quiet nature of this longing is particularly poignant. In a society where open displays of affection were often limited by social propriety, religious condemnation, and the ever-present eye of the community, intimacy often had to be cultivated in subtle ways. It might be found in a knowing glance, a secretly exchanged poem written in Latin, a hidden carving on wood or stone, or a fleeting moment of contact during a boisterous festival. It existed in the unspoken understandings within a family, the shared hardships of a community, and the silent compassion of a trusted midwife. This quiet yearning contrasts sharply with our modern tendency towards overt expressions of affection and the public broadcasting of personal lives. Yet the intensity of that internal longing, the deep human need to be seen, understood, and cherished, transcended the centuries and resonates powerfully with our own experiences. In conclusion, the journey through medieval life, marked by its peculiar customs and challenging circumstances, ultimately leads us to a profound realization. Despite the vast historical distance, the people who inhabited that world were driven by the same fundamental human impulses that animate us today. They grappled with pervasive confusion about their existence and the mysteries of the world around them. They possessed an inherent curiosity that pushed them to understand, to innovate, and to seek meaning in their lives. And, perhaps most universally, they harbored a deep and often quiet longing for closeness, for love, intimacy, friendship, and belonging that transcended social barriers, religious strictures, and the harsh realities of their daily existence. Their story is not just a tale of a distant past, but a timeless reflection of the human condition, reminding us that in the fundamental core of our humanity, we are, and always have been, deeply and enduringly alike.